Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is brought to you by, well, you. If you want to learn how to support our show, go to patreon.com/laststandmedia. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Sacred Symbols Plus, a PlayStation podcast supplement. This has been one a long time coming. I'm very excited about this episode. Been prepared about this episode. Been looking forward to this episode. My name is Colin Moriarty. I'm joined today by our friend Rick Hoeg. Rick, welcome back to the show. No legalese today. No business talk today. We did a little business talk beforehand.
Not until we get to the laws and reality and what you can create with your mind and writing.
Control would be better for that stuff in some sense, you know?
Yeah, no, we're not going to get too deep into the weeds there, I don't think, on the legalese. But yeah, and Alan Wake is one of my favorite games of all time. So I really appreciate you inviting me to this.
I remember that. I remember when we spoke last. I don't remember what it was for. I had a list. I wrote, you told me what you were playing. I wrote it down. And one of the games you brought up was Alan Wake 2. And that kind of spurred in me. I was like, shit, I was kind of going to ignore that game, even though I love Control. And I'll get into that a little bit. I think Control is fucking awesome. And I came to that game late. And I'm not a Max Payne person, so I don't have this real affinity for Remedy, although I do now. And then when you brought that up, I was like, you know what? Alan Wake was free on PS Plus, although I'm happy to buy it. I downloaded it when it was, or I added it to my download list at the time. And so I played through it twice, actually. I beat it on regular mode and on nightmare mode. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about non-scholastic things today. It's much appreciated. So Rick, welcome. Dagan Moriarty, my brother. Welcome to Sacred Symbols Plus, a show you sometimes appear on. Of course, we co-host Knockback, our retro nostalgia podcast. You do Punching Up. We do Constellation. So we are together maybe a little too often. In fact, every time I see the family, I was just seeing them for Mom's birthday a few days ago. Everyone's like, have you talked to Dagan? It's like, what the fuck do you think I do?
Way too often.
Yeah. It's like, yeah, like I talk to Dagan for 6 hours a week. So yeah, I've talked to Dagan. Dagan, how are you today, my friend?
We've talked. Yeah, if there was anything academic going on, you wouldn't see this face. No. So it must be something, a game we're talking about or something. Alan Wake, though, ironic, because I could not get out of bed this morning talking about Wake, anything. It's just
Alan asleep.
Exhausted. Absolutely exhausted.
Is that Blondie on your shirt? Who is that?
Yeah, that's Debbie.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, she is.
Excellent.
Yeah,
love it.
Yeah.
Man, there's something so... I was thinking about her recently because I've been listening to a little Blondie where you look at some of the records, some of those famous record covers of her surrounded by the band, like the guys or whatever. And I'm like, these are iconic, but she's so beautiful in a 1970s, like just nail the time and place thing, just straight up.
Agreed.
Like that's where she's from.
Agreed. And timeless. And just like, for me, I know she's not the OG front woman for a band, but she kind of is. I know if I think of like why I love female lead singers so much, it probably goes back to Mom and Dad with Fleetwood Mac, right? Stevie
and there's
Nicks.
two of them in that, right? Yeah.
What'd you say?
There's two female leads.
Yeah,
in that.
yeah. Stevie Nicks and who she just passed away.
But yeah, Michael loves her. I can't remember her name.
Yeah. And now I'm gonna have to look it up for you guys.
Well, because I was talking to her, I consider myself pretty knowledgeable on music, and I was talking to her. I'm like, I never realized there was a second woman.
Yeah,
like that sang the songs or whatever. And I was like, and then I started going through in my own time, like which ones did she sing, which ones did Steve? And I was like, oh,
Christine McVie.
That's it. There you go.
Yeah.
You pulled it out.
But Debbie Harry, come on. As far as hip hop and 70, and she still rocks. Rocks. She set the template. Everybody owes a big debt of gratitude to her. I feel like if they're helming a band, they're up front, center stage. All goes back to Debbie.
Totally. I'm a huge fan of the 80s band Missing Persons, who's fronted by Dale Bozzio, and you know that she was definitely aping Debbie Harry a little bit. All right. Let's get an Alan Wake, my friends. It's time. Alan Wake came out May 2010 on Xbox 360. It was ported to PC much later than it was supposed to be in 2012. And then in 2021, it came to PlayStation for the first time. I think it was in 2018 or 2019 that Remedy actually bought the rights back for Alan Wake from Microsoft for really nothing. And it's interesting how companies allow this to happen. This is, we won't even get into it, Hoeg, because I promise no legalese, but so interesting, like Activision letting Bungie go and just have Destiny. Do you think you would make it a little harder than that? I was so interested about. I remember that story being like, they sold it for a pittance for nothing. I don't even know what the point of even not just giving it away was, especially for a company like Microsoft. But it liberated it from Microsoft, who I don't think cared for it especially a lot, obviously, because they didn't really do much with it. And although they liked Remedy, they did Quantum Break after that and all the rest.
Yeah, my recollection of like what happened at the time is that Alan Wake comes out the same day as Red Dead Redemption.
That's insane.
And just gets killed by the sales there. And then Alan Wake, when it releases on PC, kind of finds a new audience, and people really liked it because it's a great game. But Microsoft had already moved on. And so they asked Remedy to do something new. And Quantum Break really is a kind of Alan Wake type game with a bigger TV component than even they have in Night Springs and Alan Wake. And you can see the clear through line, but I like Quantum Break. It's just not as good as Alan Wake.
Yeah, and I was reading, because I'm confused about this. Like, I should say this in the beginning. This is a spoiler cast and review discussion. We're going to spoil the entire game in its entirety, just in case you guys are curious. I am not going to do the following. We're not going to talk about how Alan Wake connects to Control or about Control, because I don't want to spoil that. We're not going to talk about Alan Wake American Nightmare, because I don't want to spoil that. We will talk about the DLC, the writer, and whatever the other one was called. And we can get into that, the ones that are more attached. I just know that there's a kind of universe percolating here, and I don't want people to think we're going to spoil all the other stuff. I don't want to spoil Alan Wake's connection to Control because I don't know what it is. I love Control, but I never played the DLC.
It's ambiguous.
Yeah. And I know and I wanted to ask you this, actually, Hoeg, before we get further. I was under the impression that Quantum Break was also in this universe, but it's not. But Alan Wake is in Quantum Break, isn't he? So
Quantum Break isn't necessarily in the same universe insofar as Control and Alan Wake kind of talk to each other. But Quantum Break does have a number of references that it's difficult to piece apart from whether or not it's in universe or related in some way, right? Like the poem you get in Alan Break at the beginning about waters being wilder and serene. Those are the last names of two of the main characters in Quantum Break. So, I mean, like, that's the kind of thing Remedy does all the time.
I love that. I got to say, at with much less skill, aping it with Lilymo. Like, all of our games are connected. I think I've said before that Super Perils of Baking, for people so there's even a special ending of Super Perils of Baking if you beat it on 100% on the hardest difficulty. That will just tell you this straight up. But Super Perils of Baking is a book that the pilot in Habroxia 2 read with her dad, the pilot in Habroxia 1 when she was young. And so if you actually my Twitter header is the picture you get at the end of Super Perils, where they're reading it and they have their little blue hair letting them know what they are. So I love the interconnectedness, but I am no Sam Lake, I'll tell you that. It's funny because Remedy, Dig, I'm curious, did you play Max Payne at all?
No.
Because I didn't either. Did you play Max Payne, Hoeg?
Yes.
Did you like those games? Yeah. Yes. So you're a Remedy person. So I'm curious, let's start here. And you have so much knowledge, and you dissect games like unlike almost anyone I've ever met, actually, which is why I'm really happy to have you here. Alan Wake was positioned as something that was supposed to be wildly different from Max Payne, right? In all ways, including the open world nature of what it was supposed to be originally, which is one of the you can see that everywhere in the game, which I think is so funny. Like how it was they just took all these pieces of geography that they had and used them again. How did you feel then in the time leading up to Alan Wake? Were you excited about it from the beginning? Were you one of the people that played it instead of Red Dead? I don't think I remember that piece of lore about Red Dead coming out that same day. It all matches up, though. It reminds me a little bit of 2015 Metal Gear Solid 5 and Mad Max coming out the same day, and kind of one getting killed because of that, I think. So talk to me about kind of the lead in and getting there. Did you play it at the time? Were you looking forward to it? Go on.
So I had played Max Payne, and Max Payne, if you haven't played it, is kind of a weird tone for a video game. It's a noir, and it's voiced over similar to Alan Wake, and it uses that kind of prose of all this metaphor and kind of ridiculousness that it kind of became known for. But while I like that narratively, Alan Wake at the time was going through this, we're going to make a GTA 3 type game, and then it goes dark for a long, long time, so much so that it was kind of a vaporware project. Right? Like at that point in time in video games, it was one of those games like Agent, if we're talking about Rockstar again, that just goes away. And then Alan Wake kind of came back in its linear level version, and I was excited about it because I like storytelling. I'm a narrative guy first, which is one of the reasons Alan Wake is as high on the list for me as it is. But I was excited to play it. I bought Alan Wake and Red Dead together. I remember coming home from the Best Buy with those in my bag. That's a good day. But I was excited about playing it. I didn't know how scary it would be. I'm not a big jump scare fan. And Alan Wake pretty much avoids that entirely. It is more kind of existential dread and something that I enjoy more. But No, I was excited about it, and I was excited about the collector's edition that I got, which had like the Alan Wake, I think Files is the name of the book in it, where you get like a whole set of lore pieces from in-universe that I thought was really cool. But I didn't know that I would love it as much as I did until I got to the end, really.
Yeah, it's I remember it, I expressed this on Sacred, and it frustrates the shit out of me in that I remember when it came out in 2010. I remember the time just because we had just moved to the new offices in San Francisco at IGN that year. And I remember people being hyped about it. And I'm like, this looks good. I remember at the time, I was a big fan of Shadow Complex, for instance, on Xbox 360. I would jump into Xbox 360 when I thought there were games there for me. And it wasn't that hard, and it's definitely not hard still to this day to keep up with all of it if you tried. I just kind of fell off. So Alan Wake was one of those games that came and went because people were like, you're not going to like it. Like, the gameplay sucks. That's why I remember people saying like the game, and
wow.
I think
and they
Charles
still
Aniet,
do. We can talk about that a little bit, but
which is nonsense. I think total nonsense. I didn't play the Xbox 360 version. I played it at 60 frames on PS5. I thought it was fun and unique and novel and exciting. So I don't agree with that at all. It bums me out that I listen to people, because I was just noting on a recent podcast about like Baldur's Gate and stuff like this, where I'm like, I just know when I'm not going to like a game. I know myself well enough. But I didn't make that determination about Alan Wake. I let other people make that determination based on them knowing me, and they were wrong. So it took me 13 years or so to figure out that Alan Wake is not only very much for me, but that I probably would have been a huge evangelist of this game, very similar to how I was an evangelist of Shadow Complex on Xbox 360 back in the day, which also comes from a literary background in terms of its connection to Orson Scott Card and all of that. And that's, for people that don't know, Shadow Complex is about a Republican Democrat civil war, basically. And that book is dope. So, Dig, I want to you're on the other side of the spectrum from Hoeg, really, where you're coming into this very late, right? So
super late.
Hoeg was there early. I knew about it, but came late. You probably weren't really even aware of this game, or if you were, it was just a passing name. And so you're coming to it quite late. I'm curious what your experience with it leading up to it is. And I'm really curious to know, and I'll start with you in terms of subjectivity, which is like, what did you think? Because I also love this game. I think this is one of the most unique and novel games I've ever, pardon the pun, I've ever played. And it's certainly not made you wish that it was made at a much higher level in some way, and that it could be like, and I hate to say, because people can be like roll their eyes, but like more of like a Naughty Dog game. You can imagine Alan Wake being a legit 10, like total masterpiece level game. So I'm curious what you thought, because I think when we first talked, you weren't really feeling it. And I try to leave you alone. So especially when I learned that after a couple hours, I'm like, I'm just going to let it go.
Yeah.
And see what you think. So I've been, with bated breath, really wondering what you think. Talk to me about it.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I mean, this is really another case for me of where the hell was I 15 years ago? How did I miss this? And it was really only recently with talk of the sequel and sort of the internet din with all the excitement that I was like, what is this thing? And then looking into Remedy as a developer, then getting interested, then you put it on my radar, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to play this. I'm just going to jump on Steam. I'm going to go the traditional route, just play the OG version, not the remake. Let me see what this is like from a 2010 perspective. I'm completely missing it. And, it was a rare, slow burn for me. Usually I'm a pretty easy mark. I'm not like really a tough crowd. I usually enjoy things, but it took me probably 2 or 3 hours to get hooked. I was a little dubious. And then I think I was enjoying it. And I think what happened was when I found out that ingenious little touch, again, this is such a Dagan hook of the way it was going to present itself like an episodic TV thing. And it did the whole previously on. I was like, all right, there's something special here. And then I think I kind of let down my guard. And then from there on out, I enjoyed it. And I always say the mark of it for me is because I'm doing this on the side. I'm doing it at night after the kids go to bed and everything, was I was looking forward to it each night. And to actually playing it, I was really looking forward to playing it. And I found it to be such really generally in broad strokes, like really well made, very ingenious, very creatively done action game. I thought it could have been a little scarier, and we could get into that. For me, I don't like horror, but I do like to be frightened by things. But I find, all the sort of horror, sci-fi horror survival games, that at least the ones that I'm aware of, Resident Evil series, Silent Hill franchise, really sets itself apart from almost everything. And just the little but ingenious things that it does. And I just enjoyed it. It took me a little longer, as it usually does. It took me probably close to 13 hours to beat it, in that initial run. And I just had a great time with it, man. I'm really looking forward to October so I could play the sequel.
Me too, dude. I mean, I feel bad because it comes out, I think, the day before I get married.
Yes, it does. I noticed that.
So everyone's gonna have to wait that are coming to wedding. I apologize about that. It's the same with Spider-Man, which comes out the week before, and I keep wondering, like, what will be my flavor on this game that week? Will I be like playing it with great urgency as I count down the hours? Am I gonna be nervous and too nervous? I don't know. So,
you'll need something to distract yourself. So
yeah, probably. So Hoeg, are you a Twin Peaks fan?
I would say I have enjoyed certain bits of Twin Peaks, but I wouldn't call myself a fan.
I'm watching it now for the first time, encouraged by. So I even got a Paramount. So I always cycled through everything. I have a Paramount Plus account now, which I never even thought I would ever have.
Nice,
because they have all of the Twin Peaks stuff, and I started watching it. It's actually Ramon, who's been on our show before, my best friend. That's his like favorite thing of all, like ever, is Twin Peaks. He fucking loves it. And so I told him that I was watching it, and he was so amped about it. And I'm only a few episodes in, but what I didn't realize was this game isn't inspired by Twin Peaks. It kind of is Twin Peaks in a lot of different ways. Like I did not appreciate that at all. Like they're not beat for beat, but a lot of the sets, like the diner
and the coffee and
right.
Yeah.
It's yeah. The coffee. Right. Exactly. Even just like the logging industry being in that area and all of the rest. And obviously it's not Alpine, but the Pacific Northwest sort of feel, the geography and all the rest. I didn't the FBI agent and it's pretty deeply inspired by more than inspired by Twin Peaks. It really invokes that. And it's so funny. So I played through the game twice all the way through without really even knowing that.
Yes.
Right. And so there's also different ways to appreciate and approach that. So were you familiar with that at the time too, the Twin Peaks inspiration? I guess they kind of had to wear that on their sleeve in some sense.
I did know that, yes. And while I like the Twin Peaks stuff, I like that the plot line is a little bit closer to what I would call Stephen King, which is this kind of primal forces of good versus evil, and then like metaphors. Like I love the clicker to death. Like the clicker is my favorite thing. And that I just think worked out really well in the game. And them opening the game pretty famously with a Stephen King reference is something that I still remember, right? Like you don't get answers in a true horror. The fun is in the journey quote. And I really think that for me, last time I was on here, we were talking about Final Fantasy. Alan Wake having this kind of primal elemental light versus darkness, creativity versus anti-creativity, this whole thing that it does the whole game is right in my wheelhouse. I love that stuff. I love big damn hero stuff is what I usually call it. And Alan Wake is a writer, and he's not a typical big hero, but what you actually face in that game is killing darkness with light.
It's interesting to me, Hoeg, too, that it's somewhat, though there's a lot of texture to it, finding the manuscript pages, a lot of dialogue, some optional encounters and things of that nature, which are kind of cool. Like I love turning the light on for the dude in the jail cell and doing stuff like that and just getting like little extra beats. It's so much more straightforward and less complicated than Control, which was really complex in my opinion. Like to the point where I remember I was basically studying it for our Spoilercast back in 2019, being like, there's so much, you have the live action shit, all the documents, and it's so crazy. And I can't wait to play that game again in anticipation for Control 2. I'm going to wait.
Well, the spoiler for me is that I don't much care for Control.
That's so interesting. What I think Control is. Oh, I don't want to say what don't you like about it?
I think Control clearly has more dynamic action, which is what I think people most like about it as a different from Alan Wake. But Alan Wake has this wonderfully detailed, layered story that, in my opinion, you can just kind of dive as deep as you want into, and it just keeps giving you returns and interesting things as you try to think about whether Alan Wake is a fictional character. Of course he is, right, in our world. But is he a fictional character in his world? Who created Tom Zane? What, that kind of stuff. I love that. And it just circles in on itself and spirals so well versus Control, which is kind of trying to demysticize things. But more importantly for me, it doesn't really have a narrative plot line that I was interested in throughout, right? So Control has dynamic combat. I enjoyed that. Has some of the cool bits and pieces of what would a federal bureau look like that handled this stuff. But as for the actual plot line of Dylan and what's happening with the hiss, I just wasn't as interested.
Yeah, I understand that completely. And again, we promise no spoilers. None of that is a spoiler. And that's the way I think about it too, from framing, which is Control is the big game and Alan Wake's the small game, where like Alan Wake's a fraction of what Control is even about. And it's cool to be able to delve into that mini story. It reminds me of like the old Star Wars novels or something, where you get like a little something meaty and juicy. So I totally understand that. I'll be interested to see what Dagan thinks of Control when I'm sure we'll get there in anticipation of Control 2. I feel like Control 2 is a little further out than maybe we think though. So I don't know when that's going to happen, and I'll fall into that hole once more. I actually want to play Quantum Break and American Nightmare too, which I think I'm going to do on Xbox, which is interesting because I almost never play things on Xbox for no reason. All right, my friends, let's get into what we think about the story itself and the setting and all of this and how we kind of describe the game. Dig, you might be a little lost on this reference, although maybe you wouldn't be, but Hoeg, I wonder what you think of this as well, which is that I consider this game kind of like an action-oriented Quantic Dream game that meets Deadly Premonition and obviously has a deep Twin Peaks aesthetic and feel, but that it's truly unlike anything I've ever played, which I think is really one of the major draws about it. I think that the game could be improved in a lot of different ways. I think it's great, like awesome, love it. But it doesn't have that level of quality that even games of its time did. When you think about, and again, not to compare it to like what I would consider as the heap of the AAA pile, but the year before Uncharted 2 came out. Now imagine a game that felt and played and looked like Uncharted 2, but it was Alan Wake. You know, that to me is like the only thing that they could have really done to make it much better, because it's otherwise a pretty tight experience. How would you describe it to someone? And I'm curious how you would sell them on it, because it's a pretty ethereal game, and its sales numbers, I think, obviously hurt by Red Dead, as you said, but also I think kind of hindered by the fact that it's a little more high concept than your Halos or your Gears of Wars or things that people were a little more used to on that platform, which is why I give Xbox a lot of credit for publishing this game, because it definitely is different.
I'd sell people on it being one of the best stories in video games, especially if you don't like Japanese melodrama, right? Like if you can't get into JRPGs or the 40-hour things, and if you only have a dozen hours to play something, this is giving you an episode every 2 hours or so, that it's going to show you what gaming can do with storytelling in a way that many other games are not. And that's how I would usually tell folks about it, because when we get into the discussions of the combat and whether it's doing anything exciting or interesting, that's where some people tend to fall off. I've always advocated for the gameplay of a game, whether it's The Witcher or Alan Wake, to inform what your experience is with that game, right? So I like both the combat in The Witcher and the combat in Alan Wake, because they both are funneling into what the story is that they're telling. So in Alan Wake, you're a writer. You've got the elbow pads on your coat. You've got a flashlight and a pistol for the most part. And yes, I know you get some better weapons as the game goes on, but that's mostly what you're doing. And it's not too super dynamic. And this is the company that made Max Payne. They could have had you doing John Woo dives if they wanted. That's not the game that this is.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point. And by the way, I love that you brought up his outfit, just because that is such a notable thing. That is the game developer outfit, right? That's like the year going on stage on E3 2011.
That's a great
2012. Point. It's yeah, I love that. And yeah, the elbow pads. I love the character design. Like, I just love the way, I love that he's a dickhead.
I know, he's not a great person. I mean, I think one of the really interesting things I like about the Alan Wake world is that I don't think he's that good of a writer, right? Like, he's this creative force when he arrives at Cauldron Lake, and that's what's important about his story. But the actual manuscript pages are not good. Like, it's not strong writing in those manuscript pages. And I think that's a fantastic beat, that they need the creative force. The Dark Presence needs that creative force, but it doesn't need to be like erudite. It doesn't have to be this fancy writing in order to bring the Dark Presence into our world, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's very, I don't mean to insult them, because I think they're all good writers, but like very Dan Brown pop fiction style stuff. And that's how they play him up, which I think is...
he's like a pulp novelist.
Sure.
Yeah, totally. Dig, let's get into the intro. And you said you were not taken with it in the beginning, pardon the pun. I'm doing a lot of puns today. Now a taken pun. I couldn't believe it.
Go with it.
Yeah. So because it's so interesting. I felt like the game really hooked me from the very beginning. I loved the ferry ride and that very conspicuous and weird conversation with Pat Maine, and the tension of being there, and you can kind of get the vibe that Alan's a little bit of a douchebag and he's famous and trying to kind of get away. And obviously it leads into this, what I think is a crazy move by his wife. Like, you can't really blame him. He's like trying to get away. He's got writer's block. They're probably rich. So it's like there's no financial urgency probably for him to write this new novel.
Yeah. Looks like they have money, right?
Right. Like he has these huge books. We find out later he's on the Harry Garrett show or whatever. And they're good. You give him a little bit of time. And she draws this crazy story out, and we don't really know what to make of it, I guess. But just by kind of setting him up and being like, look, I brought your typewriter to vacation, all very crazy shit. So she's not kind of a great person either. Well,
and she was talking to the doctor the whole time before the game.
Right. Exactly. You learn that on the video or the audio recording, which is really cool too. Nice little Levine-esque touch there, I thought, with the audio, some of the audio recordings. So yeah, talk to me about the beginning and what wasn't drawing you in about that, because I was quite smitten with this. I was like, yes, the Pacific Northwest town, the Deer Fest, the weird encounters at the diner, and the guy with the key coming out in the road and being like, you forgot your key. Yeah, that was a pretty cool, compelling setup.
You know, it's funny. So it got you right away. It hooked you right away. That's interesting.
Yeah, I would say so. In fact, I would say that it gets in some parts weaker than that. I think in some ways it ends weaker than it starts, just from my intrigue. And that's kind of what Hoeg was saying earlier about the journey as opposed to the resolution. But
that's an interesting.
I like the ending, but I do like the clicker. I think I'm totally on board with the ending isn't as strong as it ramps up into being. Like, my favorite part of the game is waking up at the lodge and dealing with Dr. Hartman, and then going to the farm and the old gods of Asgard and everything that happens there. Give me the poet and the muse every single time. I'll take it.
Yeah, right on. What did you, Dig, want to, or what wasn't taking you at that first?
Yeah, it's interesting. You guys make a good point. It does start off with a big punch and a lot of oomph in terms of atmosphere, for sure. And not just the referential things, which are awesome. You guys already talked about David Lynch, especially Twin Peaks. It's definitely full of that. It's definitely, I love when things are referential in a pop culture fashion, when those nods, and that was very obvious from the jump. So I was looking for those things. And of course it does the very transparent ones where it's sending up Stephen King and it's sending up Hitchcock. And, I think it makes a direct reference to the movie Deliverance. And of course you have, whether you have The Shining all over the place, whether it's Kubrick Shining or Stephen King Shining, take your pick. But I was looking for those things, whether they were really obvious or a little more subtle. So, I saw a little bit of Misery in this, again, Stephen King, right? Mm-hmm. I saw a little of Cronenberg's History of Violence, kind of like that Stranger in a Strange Place type thing, Straw Dogs, that whole dynamic of being in a place where you can't really trust anybody from the jump. So that was interesting to me. But I think in terms of what the gameplay would be, I think it took a little while to get there, because you're kind of meandering. You're having the conversation with the wife. You're exploring the house. It kind of sets you to slow for some of those sequences where you can't jump, you can't run, you're not interacting with your limited arsenal, right? This is sort of a theme with me this year, but I'm looking for the fun, right? So it took a little while. That was a slow burn, at least for me. But I'll say, I have a much more limited gameography than you guys do. But I'll even say I would come recommending this for the gameplay, because it is just, for me, at least for what I've played and what I could compare it to, it is a little different. It feels a little different, and it felt fluid enough. I mean, if you compare it directly to, a Naughty Dog game, like Colin was saying, or an Uncharted game, right? Yeah, obviously it has those glaring differences. But when you're in the game and you're spending that dozen hours, I had a great time. It just was kind of that slow burn. I didn't really know what to think. And I think I was a little afraid too. It's like, wow, this is the better part of 15 years ago. How does this game hold up from a game? Because games have evolved so much during that space, where games are just think of Horizon or something more modern. It's like, holy shit, whether, let alone a Rockstar game. So, but yeah, man, that once it hooked me, I think it hooked me with its creativity, but it just hooked me with that sort of creative sense of fun and doing things a little different than other stuff that I've played. So I just needed to get into the meat of the game, I guess, after the mystery is kind of set in motion. And that's like, all right, this
other
is
than the tutorial, when you kind of meet the light and all of that, you don't really play very much in the beginning. Like, obviously the combat ramps up, the set pieces ramp up. You brought up an awesome set piece, for instance, on the farm later. Where are you on? I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just saying it's the best.
Oh, Hoeg, that was
I
you.
love the farm.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the farm. We'll get there. I also think the farm is probably the greatest part of the game. But I can't keep but help coming back to the artifacts of the open world. I just think that it's what I love about the game too is not only playing it in the story, but knowing a little bit about, and certainly not everything. I'm not all encompassing on this, but going a little bit deep into the making of it and the kind of torture, as we were talking earlier, Hogan. I love that they were smart enough and wise enough to kind of say, like, we can't deliver the game we're trying to deliver in an open world and a sandbox. Like, it needs to be linear, and that that must have been a very painful process to chop up your own game like that. That was sold to Microsoft under different circumstances and then kind of just dwelling in the space for a long period of time. Because I remember Alan Wake was originally just announced for consoles, and then it was later that Microsoft, obviously came in and became the publisher, which is the way it goes often. But I love that they were it's just a canny move. I mean, that saved the game. This wouldn't have worked because that's Deadly Premonition. The game Deadly Premonition is the game that they were trying to otherwise do, in my opinion. Something that was a little more open world. You're driving around, and that's even more low budget than this game is. I mean, that game is truly low budget, but that's the same thing. And so I love that they, just from a tradesman point of view, it's like, yeah, what a great move. And that must have sucked because you worked on all these things. You worked on getting cars to drive. You worked on these huge maps and this town and all these different things. And now you have to kind of figure out how to use it and reuse it. I mean, I didn't really make the connection in my first playthrough, but the second playthrough, I made the connection that the hospital is just the lodge. It's the same asset. And it's supposed to be the same place, but that maybe is some sort of a decision of its own in terms of just not having a lot of interior spaces to work with. And so I can see all the seams on it as someone who understands games, I think, a little bit better than the average bear. And we all do. And I think I love that. And so that taken to and combined with what I think is really compelling gameplay. And see, this is where I get a little mad that people kind of dissuaded me from playing it back in the day. I think the gameplay is mega clever. I love the idea of using the flashlight. Kind of, you have these dueling weapons. And what was funny, Hoeg, for me was, so I played it on normal. I thought it was pretty difficult at times. And then I gave it a little bit of time and started playing Sea of Stars and doing other stuff. And then I went back and started playing it again on Nightmare. And the game was easier for me because you let things settle in. There was only a couple of times where I even died at all. And there was one time where I died like a bunch of times because I was like, fuck, I'm really messing this part up in the last chapters. But you get used to it, and it becomes this fluid and really interesting idea of even just using. First of all, I learned you got to use your flares a lot more than, be aggressive with the flares, even walk towards the enemies.
Run right at them.
Right. It's just, there's so many different ways to play it. And I really came to love the gameplay just as much as I loved the story and the setting, which I was surprised by because the way people talked about it, I just think people are just way off base.
Yeah, I love how cinematic it is, right? Like, you can complain about the dynamism of the combat, but I love that it goes into slow motion when you kill one of them. When you've got the flare up and it's flaring out your TV camera, well, you run at things, you can barely see anything. I love all of that. Like, they were clearly very invested in how this looks from a kind of movie perspective. And I think it looks fantastic throughout. So yeah, it has always worked for me because I like light versus darkness as a motif. I like how this is presented with some of the cinematic elements. I like when you dodge, you get that slow motion movement too. But I know a number of people who say, it mostly doesn't evolve. There aren't bosses or things. And I just don't think it would be improved by being a Dark Souls game. I don't think it would improve by having a bunch of these other things. But again, I'm not the world's best video game player. I just play a lot of them. So I also like that it challenges occasionally, but it's not a sweaty game at all. You're not worried about making it through.
In fact, it reminds me a lot of my play of JRPGs where I just end up with way too many items because I'm playing way too conservatively. It's like you could have played so much more hardcore. You have like 7 flashbang grenades.
Pick out that hunting rifle. Come on, you got it.
Yeah, Yeah, no, exactly. I love that there's in Nightmare it was there were a couple times where it got a little scarcer, but they give you a lot of leeway and there's a lot of inherent choice in it. I think you're right. I love the restraint of no bosses, and Dagan and I talk about that a lot on Knockback, how the Uncharted, we brought up Uncharted 2 in a positive way, so let's bring it up in a negative way. The Lazarevich boss fight, I mean, that sucks. Like that. You just don't need that. The game doesn't have to end that way, and that's a very video game thing. And I like that they were basically, yeah, we'll give you like a bigger, like creature in this game, or we'll give you like a bigger boss in this game. But in Alan Wake, we want to just give you like the car flying at you.
We're going to end with the words. We're really focused on creativity.
I love that.
The theme goes all the way through that game.
And that's something that I realized too as I was playing it, which I loved too, was, and this is kind of writing yourself out of a corner in some way, but just the idea that you're finding weapon, and Alan Wake says it at some point, like you shouldn't be finding bang grenades here or whatever, that they're just writing these things in for you to find, or that these things are written in very convenient places, is brilliant. Because it's like, why would you find these things here otherwise? Right. And the light and all of that, and the save points and healing and all of that, it's all very convenient, and that convenience folds into the game and the story, which I think is pretty cool. Dig, I was curious what you thought of the I loved the Pat Main character, and I was curious what you thought of him, and the inclusion of, and Hoeg had brought this up earlier, that Quantum Break gets in a major way with its live action stuff or whatever, that becomes much more prominent. But I was curious what you thought about Pat Main, the radio host and the radio shows that you find, and then also the TVs that you find as well that show real life action, including Alan Wake himself, which I think I love that shit, man. And I think it works somewhat well in this situation because of the graphics and all of that. But as the games get more realistic, that's what I really loved about Control, was you would find the videos of a familiar actor doing things. And yeah, so I'm curious what you made of that element of bringing in the real life and having the Twilight Zone style shit and the talk AM radio dude, or maybe it's supposed to be like coast to coast style radio. I don't really know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, how can you not love a send up to Twilight Zone and Rod Serling? And they got their own thing called Night Springs, and that's kind of another findable, thing to kind of sit down and enjoy. Same thing with the coffee thermoses, Seems I was fully caffeinated, man. I think I found all 100 of those. Went out of my way. And then, the manuscripts, again, just elegant, just enough to do, just enough of a weapon inventory to juggle. The flashlight as a reticle, but also part of your straight up offense, and the whole light dark mechanic. And again, just enough to do, just enough to learn. I love what I have to really say also, this is not topical for this thing, but what Hoeg was saying too about the slow-mo. Just that not only is it cinematic and fun and kind of ratchets up the tension a little bit, but I love the fact of like incorporating the slow-mo as a mechanic. When the Taken reveal themselves, you have that beat to kind of adjust the strategy. Just enough time. They give you, am I going to dodge? Am I going to turn around and flash my high beams? Am I going to try to shoot? Am I going to run? So again, like something that really, those inventive little things that make it fun to play and made me look forward to it each day. I love that kind of stuff. I love the radio host as just a clever little way to get some exposition into the game. Just kind of keep you posted on where you're at and what's going on in the world. And the TV, just something fun to find. Again, I feel like they layered it with just enough stuff where, like the best games, where it doesn't feel overwhelming. There's not a lot to do, but there's certainly enough to keep you busy and enough just to keep you entertained. I thought the voice acting was pretty good in some of this too. Some of it's hokey, but I think like Alan Wake's writing style, and you guys are saying the pulp sort of dime store spinner rack type thing, like good enough to have the full life-size standee of Alan Wake, and he's a bestseller, but maybe that speaks to the public and they don't really know, they like the cheesy books. But
right is like Alan Wake wrote this game, right? Like that's, if we're going to get Spoilercast, he wrote what you're playing, and so that all works with the manuscript.
So good.
And that's what I was going to bring up next. Is that's one of the most clever things. And Hoeg, I'll let you expand on this. Like I think the manuscript idea is brilliant. The idea that sometimes you find pages of things that have happened. Sometimes you find pages that foreshadow things that will occur. I remember, I think one of the early pages in the manuscript you find foreshadows that you're going to encounter someone with like a chainsaw or something. So, you're kind of like, oh, I'm going to get like this mini boss style encounter coming up. I really, really loved that. And what I really thought was cool, and I got to give them a special tip of the cap of this, is because I'm not usually a fan of forcing people to play through a game twice, but I think this game's so good and that you need to kind of play through it twice to understand more of it. And I still don't. I read a bunch of stuff to even try to understand the things that I didn't understand. It's a very complicated game, in my opinion. I mean, it's very straightforward, but there's a lot of nuance that I missed. I'm not like the most sophisticated viewer of fiction, obviously, but I love that they strung you through with this manuscript. And then when you play it again, there are manuscript pages that you can only find when you play it on Nightmare to complete the story, which I think is really neat. So you find things like the lyrics of the song, or like old Zane poems or something, like some weird stuff like that just fill in the crevices in the story. So I really dug that a lot. I don't recall a mechanic that plays on the story in such a meta level. And
that was the big sales pitch when the game came out to me. Like, that's all I really knew about it, was you were going to go find these pages about something that was happening to you in a horror story. And the way they presented it was so much better than I thought. Like, that seemed to me like a USA movie I had seen before, or maybe even Mouth of Madness or something more famous than that. Like, it seemed like a trope that I would recognize and that I knew about. And then the way it's used in this game is to not just be like magical that you're doing this, which of course it is with Cauldron Lake, but also that you've got that missing week. You wrote it yourself. You're recognizing these things. And I think you said it very well, Colin. There's actually a magic in the game development side of things, of the order that you are getting these pages in, that they have to establish early on that it's true. Like, they do things that are in the past, that you saw these scenes. Then when they do something that says something like, I was so exhausted when I thought I escaped from the forest, and then I heard the chainsaw, or however that one goes.
Right, exactly.
You're like, you get that shiver. You're like, you're in Alan Wake's shoes for just a minute. You're like, well, I hope I can take that guy.
And it reminds me of, I think, what's necessary, the extra oomph that's necessary out of a game like this to experience all of that. Because I can imagine people playing this for gameplay's sake, which I think is fine, but it reminds me of BioShock, where if you're not listening to the audio diaries and getting all the environmental cues and really paying attention to the storytelling in the space, I don't know why you're really playing the game at all. And so I hope people really took the time when you would find one of those manuscripts to read them. I did every time, like, 100 times or 130 times or whatever it was.
That was my favorite part. Yeah. And they have a lot of them that give you like insight into other characters and what they're thinking in a way that you don't traditionally get in video games, right? That's the bonus you get from reading a novel, is you get to see narration and omniscient narrators tell you about what other people are thinking and how they're operating. And this one does that a little bit in a way that we don't get in video games. So I think they just do it so well. And it has some of my favorite beats for characters ever. And one thing I wanted to add there is that you asked me about Max Payne earlier. So Max Payne is ostensibly a game where you're a cop in New York taking down a drug cartel, right? Like, that's what you know it as. But even having played it the first time, it's much grander than that. Like, Max Payne breaks the fourth wall a couple times, but also he's taking down what may or may not be the gods of Norse mythology that are dealing out various drugs and working through the New York streets. So you have a guy that's running a pharmaceutical company named Woden, and you're working through all these various things. It's a common remedy refrain. You'll see it in Control as well. But I loved that, right? Like, Max Payne is so much bigger and weirder than you think it is when you start playing that game. And so that's one of the things I was looking forward to in Alan Wake. And of course, Alan Wake is even bigger and weirder than Max Payne is.
It's funny to bring up Max Payne again too, because I wonder, Rockstar owns it, and I wonder if they would try to fold that in, or if that would all be folded in too, if they were able to do that. Because I think even Death Rally, their first game, like that Twisted Metal clone that they made, which was, I think, Remedy's first game, that's in the Alan Wake universe too, because I think there's posters of it, like in some place in like a bedroom or something, which is hysterical. So I love that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they'll do that kind of thing all the time, I have no doubt.
Yeah, the referential stuff I think is fun, the self-referential.
But like, when you're in a level in Alan Wake and you go and you read like a bit of Sudden Stop, like the Alex Casey story, it's narrated by the Max Payne voice actor, and it sounds exactly like Max Payne. It's like the biggest blizzard in New York City history, and it's the front of Max Payne. So it's like all these things wind up blending. This is the kind of thing that I mentioned I really like digging into. Like you can go as intellectually deep as you want on this stuff. And by the time you get to the end of the game, the one thing I don't like about those kinds of stories that have that ambiguity and whatnot is that you have to trust the story you're being told at a certain level, like that it's going to benefit you to think about it this hard. And Alan Wake rewards that throughout, where other stories kind of, oh no, it's just a mystery. I'm thinking of like Lost, the TV show, and things like that. Alan Wake basically always has something that says, no, it's interesting. And Quantum Break, I think I mentioned to you, but when we were setting this up, Colin, you're at a university in the first act of Quantum Break, and they clearly had a class on Alan Wake, and they're discussing like the various things and questions that are in Alan Wake about shoeboxes and clickers and Tom Zane and everything else. And I love that. Like you can read that whole blackboard, and it takes you 25 minutes, and you're still like, oh yeah, those are all open questions from Alan Wake. Wow.
Yeah, it's inspiring actually as a writer of much less sophisticated games and stories that because I always make fun of the little universe or little galaxy syndrome. Dagan and I always talk about it, about beating things into the ground and all of that. But when it reminds me a little bit of Sea of Stars and The Messenger, the Sabotage games, which are connected, but it's ambiguous, and I think they're even thousands and thousands of years apart. And like that kind of shit is cool to me. And exploring it through different games, so it's not Star Wars and Star Wars and Star Wars and Star Wars.
Everything happens on
Alan Wake and Control and Quantum Break and this and that. And yeah, they just kind of, I think it's kind of neat, and I give them a lot of credit.
Yeah, it's a good point. That's another level of thoughtfulness that's not required, but they went out of their way to do it. You know, that much more depth, that much more dimension, you know, and that's the TLC you want in a game, right? Because you want to have, especially if you're a fan, you want to kind of dig in. You want that sort of experience to last as long as possible. So when you have that level of depth, it's there for you, whether you want, you know, if you want it. If you don't want it, then you leave it alone, you know.
I think it's also a clever form of just circular marketing as well. Not that they would necessarily have that intention with Alan Wake, but at this point they do have that intention, I think. And so driving people from game to game, at least some people, like they've made me curious, so I can't be the only one, right? So
yeah,
there's some effect there too that I think is I
love that,
is really nice. And yeah, it's unlike a lot of games don't really, or a lot of companies don't really do that. They don't make like a full ecosystem. They're eager often to move on and disassociate actually from old things, which I appreciate too. So absolutely. I think you can have it both ways, and I think that's awesome.
It doesn't hurt for Sea of Stars to send people back to the Messenger,
right? And
it won't hurt them.
And most people don't know that at all either. Like They didn't make it a big deal. It's just like they said, I think even in the Kickstarter, like this game is in the Messenger universe. And then it's like up to you to figure out if that even matters. But for someone like Micah, who doesn't play side scrollers at all or Metroidvania, she's never going to play that game. She didn't even know that was connected, and it's not important. And so, and that's why I think that you have something here. Like I loved and appreciated Control without any like bearing with Alan Wake. But now I'm like even more into Control, I think. Because I'm like, this is fucking awesome. Like that. Dagan, I'm so curious to see what you think of that game, because it's about the supernatural phenomenon itself.
It sounds so cool. I love the title. Yep. That's just a great title. Something about that title is so magnetic.
Yeah, it really was. Chris is a huge fan of that game too. I don't know if he's in Alan Wake or not. I don't think we ever really talked about it before. But Dig, I want to stick with you, and we can all talk about this. I want to talk about Alice a little bit, the wife. We brought up earlier. I mean, she's an asshole, right? I mean, totally. She kind of sets this off in some weird way. She's got, first of all, it's kind of cool because it's a very dramatic and almost surreal character where she's got this mega fear of the dark. Like Dagan's afraid of the dark.
I am. Oh yeah, we were going to get into Alice that for sure.
Yeah.
Nobody's afraid of the dark like Alice Wake.
Yeah, but he's not afraid like Alice Wake is afraid of the dark. And so I don't know. I think that kind of that level of, and Hoeg had brought it up earlier, when you hear the audio in the lodge, it's really kind of the full circle thing, especially when you connect that's the scattered phone call. It's kind of fragments of that or whatever, but she's kind of an asshole. It's not to say that she deserved to have this horrible thing and die, and then she crawls out of the fucking lake at the end as presumably alive. But I wonder what you think of her, and if she kind of like is not. They both don't seem like great people, really, which is what makes it so interesting.
That's really interesting, man, because I've read that sentiment a few times, and I haven't been paying attention for that long, but I keep seeing that, and I didn't really see her as that shitty. I don't know if I was paying close enough attention, but I know she's presented as the unconditionally supportive muse character. I did get the fact of the Alan character. It's like, this is our protagonist. I'm not even sure I really like this dude. He's definitely the vehicle for the action, so I'm all in, but I'm not really sure how much I'm backing this guy. I don't really know that much about him. I know a lot of it's purposely ambiguous, but likable, charismatic. I'm not too sure. I thought Barry was more kind of lovable than the Alan Wake character, right? But Alice, I'm not. First of all, can you imagine I was married? Me and Alice together would be. We just have lights on 24 hours a day. It would be like
the well-lit room.
Yeah, your house would be indeed the well-lit room.
Watt floodlights everywhere. The fear of the dark thing, I thought, was pretty comedic because you don't see that a lot in fiction, right? It's usually a kid. If the kid's older than 8, you don't really see that. It's not a thing. But at the same time, I was wondering how they were going to kind of resolve it, because it was kind of presented comedically and almost like you got this hot wife. She's obviously an adult. She's scared of the dark. Where are they going with this? But it's kind of interesting because I've never really seen that before. It seems like a simple idea. And of course you have to play into the light dark mechanics. So you got to keep the lights on for her. There's a whole thing there. And then it kind of ties into his childhood with the clicker and his mom, and this is how you deal with the dark and all of that kind of thing. But it's interesting that you see that that's the general consensus on Alice, is that she's kind of shitty. I guess you could see her as being manipulative in some way. It's like, all right, we're going to go on a vacation, and it's revealed like, I got you here so you can make more money for us.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's reductive, right? I mean, like, I think that you can frame it that way. And certainly I think that in a good marriage, you'd hope for better communication on these kinds of things. I think you can also look at Alice as someone that wants to see her husband be creatively fulfilled and is clearly going through something when the game opens and is trying to get him out of it, right? Like, he reacts like a crazy person when she says she brought a typewriter. He runs out of the house.
Yeah. That's true. That's an interesting point.
It's a good point.
A little petulant. But I understand it because I guess I looked at it through more his eyes, especially as the protagonist, that like he's in a sort of an explosive mood. He has writer's block. That must be a really horrifying thing for someone who makes his living that way. And he's under enormous stress and he just wants to like not worry about, like, he's chasing the exact opposite feeling, right? Just in the moment. And so I get his room of being like, what the fuck, dude? Like this. Yeah, I don't know. I understand it is petulant. But he seems like a petulant person. I mean, the way he talks to other people, I think, is equally petulant as well. But you had brought up Hoeg Barry, which we obviously have to get into, the literary agent, the New York literary agent. And these guys are all New Yorkers, I guess, not really representing us incredibly well. We're not really New Yorkers. We're Long Islanders, so it doesn't matter. But what do you make of this character? You said you like him. And
Barry's awesome.
And, yeah, he's very endearing. I especially love his Rambo moments later on when he's wrapped in the Christmas lights. I think that's really, really cute and funny. I thought it was very, yeah, I like him too. They definitely, just like every other aspect of the game, Hoeg, it's got that Twin Peaks surrealism where he's so played up and in terms of, so like,
yeah, he's comic relief. Yeah. And he comes in and he hasn't heard from his best client in a week, right? Like that's when he rolls into the story and he says, you're insane. Because Alan Wake's like, I might have murdered some people in the forest, but their bodies aren't there anymore and they're taken over by darkness. And he's like, okay, great. This is a good thing. And he's a wonderful character that goes from comedic relief to even more endearing as the plot goes on, right? Like the cool part about that is that it does kind of suborn your thought process as to what he's going to be as a character. And is this guy going to get annoying like you see so often from kind of sidekick folks? And I don't think he does. I think he's always a good character, but I also don't have your vitriol towards Alice. So, hey.
It's so funny because I think that's so inappropriate the way she sprung that on him. I think it's
primarily a communications flaw more than she's not trying to hurt him. She's trying to help.
But don't you see, but after you hear the audio later on, don't you kind of, I feel like it's a little more.
Yeah, it's a bit of a betrayal.
Like she's kind of talking shit about him.
Well, and Emil turns out to be not a great person, right? So I mean, you've got all that going on, and Cauldron Lake turns out to be a magical creativity black hole.
Yes,
Like these are all problems that kind of come up on themselves, but I wouldn't put that all on Alice.
Yeah, that's fair.
I like that you could read it both ways, and listen, trophy wife, it's not free. She said, well, let's see the money. Show me the money, man. Here's the typewriter.
She also works for herself, which is,
that's true. She's got the whole photojournalist thing going on. That's important.
So she's got that. So we got to give her a little bit of credit.
Presumably that's in the 90s. That's her photo that Rose is so attached to.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, that whole bit too. Yeah, I forgot about the photojournalist thing. They do a whole thing with that. Where
she does his covers
up all night. Right?
Yeah. All right. Hoeg, you had said earlier you like you like Dr. Hartman, you said, or that chapter?
That's my favorite chapter in the game. Is waking up at the lodge.
Talk a little bit about it. Let's talk about him and the creator's dilemma. Like, what is this character's very interesting to me. Talk to me about your understanding of him.
So Dr. Emil Hartman runs the Cauldron Lake Lodge and gets artists to come to Cauldron Lake because he's constantly trying to get the creative magic working again after he had some time with Thomas Zane. Right? I mean, like that's broad strokes what he's doing. And so he's constantly messing with people. But what I really like about that chapter is, like, for a moment, for only a beat, he's telling you this lie, right? That Alice is dead and you're making it up in your head because you can't get over her. And it's like, oh, that's a kind of traditional, it's all a dream type ending to something. But it's at least interesting enough in the moment to be like, well, maybe that is. Is that real? Is that real? And then you finally resolve that chapter with basically Emil Hartman admitting that he's a liar and that Alan Wake is mostly sane at that point in time. And then as the game progresses, they do it again. They loop back on the whole Thomas Zane question, right? So it's like there's so much going on, and it starts from there. Like before that, you're doing chapters where you're primarily in the woods. You're either running from the police or you're trying to get to the Lover's Peak or whatever it is. And you're mostly doing the same thing. And then when you're in the lodge and you're going through those levels, it's when the game really shifts into high gear for me. That's where I really start to love Alan Wake.
Yeah, I think it crescendos really well. And I love that the beginning of that chapter as he comes to in the lodge and his kind of self-awareness that he has to, like you said, lie and kind of continue to act like he doesn't need to be medicated or to ask any untoward questions. Or I think he says at one point, like, this man loves to listen to himself talk. I'm going to just let him talk as they're walking around the compound or whatever. And I think that's really cool because you get that extra level of, again, like omniscience, but through the main character this time, as opposed to seeing it through the writing, which is cool. So, Dig, what did you think of the character of Dr. Hartman and the creator's dilemma? And as Hoeg said, this idea that it's a trap, basically, like it's some sort of, it's a snare in some way for the creative class. I especially love that we meet the Anderson brothers, and we'll get into that farm chapter, which surrounds them. But
so good.
And I love, did you Dig, when you met them in the diner in the beginning, did you put the jukebox on for them? And then,
yes.
And then you can go back to the jukebox and you get a trophy for playing the song again, I think, which is kind of cool.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I missed. Emil Hartman, presented, I felt like this was a villain from the word go. And this game gave me something maybe unique to my specific perspective of being from the Northeast and being from New York. But that whole fish out of water thing where now you're a New Yorker and you're in rural Washington, kind of on an island. Like, think about going to Martha's Vineyard, but out there, and there are Martha's Vineyards out there, but I just don't know what they're called. But, so you're going to this place where I have this weird fear. It's a Dagan thing where I feel like everybody's going to be affiliated, right? Like, even you can't even trust the cops there. Like, it's like this thing of looking at people as hicks and stuff like that. And I feel like this character, this creepy sort of psychiatric doctor, author, whatever he is, he had those kind of cult leader vibes, like charismatic, but more smarmy and sort of obnoxious. And, one of those characters that kind of puts you ill at ease, especially if you're channeling Barry and you're channeling Alan. It's like you're in this place where you can't trust anybody. That's why I was very I thought it was an interesting choice to give us the Sarah character, and we haven't talked about her yet, but to give you somebody who's obviously on your side, I thought was maybe a little too comforting if you wanted to continue along those lines of it's kind of every man for himself here. It's everybody against us. We're the odd man out. We're the fish out of water. We're the Barry. We're the kind of loud, brash New Yorker wearing the red bubble jacket and the loud shirt and talking a little too loud. We're not quite fitting in. We're not blending in. But the Emil character was interesting because and it's another layer of villain because, of course, later on you'll get, there's other layers to the villain, such as one person. And just figuring out too, this game I think keeps your footing. You know what I mean? Like you can't really keep your footing with it. You don't know how things are going to transpire. At first you think the sheriff is not going to be your ally, right? So it's like, all right, how is this character going to resolve? How is this character going to resolve? And it grows out to be a pretty large cast, and you don't really know who to trust.
Yeah, the Sarah Breaker character is interesting. I like there's a line where Barry refers to her as Sarah for the first time as opposed to Sheriff Breaker or whatever, and he's like, oh, is it Sarah now? Like it's very Spielbergian and letting you know that she's your friend.
Can I just say I love their names? I love Remedy names. Like all the last names are like doers, they're jobs, they're people of something. They're Wheeler, they're Wake, they're Breaker. And this goes into Quantum Break too, right? They're Serene, they're Wilder, and Control. They love their names that mean something. And if you've followed any of the stuff with Alan Wake 2, no spoilers, but a lot of the names in the characters that they've already released have that same kind of quality of like, that's not a real name. Like that doesn't sound like somebody I would know, but I understand what you're doing.
I know next to nothing about Alan Wake 2, which is awesome.
And I'm not going to spoil anything here because I'm.
Oh no, I know. I appreciate it. No, I know you're not. I was just expressing excitement that I don't think I've seen almost anything about it. I think I read somewhere like a detail that's not a big deal about who you play as.
Yeah, I did that too. Yeah,
which is fine. And then so I'm hopefully going to be going in as blind as possible come November when I actually have time to play it. Let me ask you this: was it weird? So, is there since this is Alan's story, and since we've established that he's not the most talented writer, could you excuse any bad parts of the story as intentional?
Yes.
Because there's things, because like for instance, he like cold clocks Dr. Hartman in front of the cops.
Love that.
In the police station. And it's very surreal because no one gives a shit. He doesn't care. They don't care.
Yeah, like Barry hustles him out.
Right, exactly. And the very facet of Hoeg, and you could speak on this maybe, is they're not suspicious of him and his wife's disappearance or like all the things that are happening. They just don't seem to be particularly concerned to like want to question or hold him or anything like that. It just all seems very convenient. But I guess what you're saying is that you could shrug any of these kinds of things off as being like, pulp writing.
Well, and the introduction of the Nightingale character kind of comes in and diffuses what you would expect, which is the cops are after you and the sheriff's after you and those kinds of things, because Nightingale's so crazy that the cops have to be like, no, don't just shoot up places, man. And so that's the reason that character exists, I think. But yes, it's a very pulp character, right? Like Nightingale's trying to avenge his partner's death or whatever, and he's just shooting at Alan Wake all the time. It's like, yeah, all right. And one of the beats that I really love, so here's where I give my full tilt on this, right? Because my favorite game last year was a game called Immortality, which some people tell you is not a game, but it was my favorite experience last year because it's about storytelling. It's about the act of creation. And that's one of my favorite kind of themes in life, right? For those that don't know me, I'm a lawyer, I'm a business lawyer, but a lot of my clients are entrepreneurs, they're dreamers, they're going out there and trying to get something done and created. And Alan Wake is focused like a laser beam or like a focused light from a flashlight on talking about creation and what it means and what it doesn't mean, right? There's a little beat that they have in like chapter 1 or chapter 2 where they talk about anti-creation being darkness and the creator, the writer, spreading light around. And that's a metaphor not just for his story, but a metaphor for the game, obviously, in the darkness and light. And they go through the whole game talking about what it means to create in a way that I think is just really, really cool. So when you've got a game that's based around the notion of what it means to tell a story, and then you've got story beats about people trying to take advantage of that, and the Dark Presence is nothing if not somebody trying to take advantage of creation, right? Like Barbara Jagger is also the editor. And one of the things that I think is really cool about Alan Wake's powers is that for the most part, and this is another beat in one of the chapters, he says, the story's a monster on its own, right? And you hear this from writers. that the story goes off on its own direction. The characters have to be themselves. They have to maintain themselves, and you don't quite know where it's going to go. And Alan Wake is God in this universe, but not an omniscient, not an omnipotent God. He has to kind of use what he's got in front of him on the game board, and it has to make sense or the story falls apart. So it's just a really interesting kind of conceit to me of when he finally tries to save his wife, he has to make all the things fit into a story that makes some amount of sense, even if it's horror beats, and he can't move things too far. So yes, you can use it as a kind of cover for pulpy writing. And I think the game has pulpy writing, but it's also just this really elegant discussion of what it means to create and how far you can move people and what a puppet master does and why you don't like certain writing that you don't like. One of the things I hate the most in TV writing from time to time is when you can feel like the scriptwriter has to get a person to do this or has to get them over to this location. And you're like, that doesn't make any sense. You can just see the puppet strings. And Alan Wake is about that, right? The Creator's Dilemma, as the title of Emil Hartman's book, is about what it means to create.
Yeah, it's really, really well said. I know we can count on you for this top tier.
I think about this stuff way too much.
No, it's great, man. I mean, I love it. It's awesome. Dig, I wanted to talk to you about, I guess and we were talking about this earlier, the seams of the open world, but something I experienced in gameplay, which I really loved. First of all, I love the wooded, dark wooded settings. For some reason, things didn't get repetitive for me in this game, even though they are repetitive. And again, knowing that they sat there and really had to dice the game up and figure out how they were going to use the assets they had and reconfigure them into this more linear episodic game that they wanted to deliver, that I think Xbox then kind of got in the way of themselves because they didn't allow it to be released that way, which probably would have really helped it, actually.
Yeah.
Which is weird because I think that's annoying and became annoying, especially Telltale doing that. But that would have been very novel at the time. That wasn't a very common thing at all to do. But one of the things I wanted to talk about, and I don't know if you guys noticed this, although I'm sure you did, is that I think that there was a great level of design in towards always drawing your eye to where you needed to go. You're in these dark wooded areas. This is a pretty sophisticated game that really probably, at least internally, although probably externally as well, play tested into oblivion in terms of trying to track people's eyes, because the game does a really nice job of never turning you around. It was very rare for me to ever get turned around. There's always a light source or something drawing you, a weather pattern, the wind direction, crescendoing noise as you move towards or away from things. I don't know if you picked up on this as well, but this is something I really loved about Alan Wake.
Very well designed. Very impressive. I felt the same way. They'll do something with something subtle. They'll put, if you're in a wooded path that looks like it's repeating itself and you don't have the Hansel and Gretel breadcrumbs, they'll just put a rusty tractor wheel there. And then you're like, all right, I didn't see that before. Mm-hmm. Or a bit of yellow, whether it's the yellow writing and the arrows or the construction signs. A little subtle nod. Sometimes they'll do it with progressions or checkpoints or a new enemy encounter or something. But there's always something like you said, something out in the distance that's kind of drawing your eye. And it's something that you're kind of questioning at the same time as far as navigating. It's like, is that? But it always turns out to be pretty right. And they do. You could see the rehashed architecture and assets here and there, but they do make a good job of making the world feel pretty vast when you get into it and you realize there are delineated boundaries here. But it still feels pretty open. It still feels pretty scary in that anything could happen anywhere. And man, I just love what you guys said about the mediocre writing idea. I have to just go back to that for a second. Just kind of the bad writing as a concept, because that to me seems like a bottomless well for ideas for anybody to catch, to kind of jump
not a
in
lake.
And say, right? It's like,
yeah, it's not.
That's just,
exactly.
that's just fun. To kind of take that concept and make something meta. And, I just love that. I wasn't really thinking about it that way before you guys were talking about it. And I was like, that's a really neat concept to build something around for a game.
The silver lining of it being 13 years old is it's been percolating in my brain for a long time. And it's
a fantastic point.
Let me also advocate. I agree with you in terms of the level design itself and the weenies out in the distance and everything else. But I also want to advocate for the UI, because the compass that they actually built in this game is one of those compasses with a waypoint that kind of is really just mirroring what would be GPS directions on the ground. Like, it's telling you how to go forward. It's not just putting a dot out where you need to get to eventually. So Alan Wake, if you want to, you could stare at the compass and it will take you through the forest, as scary as it is, or as otherwise unable as you are to figure out which direction to go. As you put that yellow dot on the top of your compass, and it's going to get you to where you need to go. And it's really, really smart in terms of playing a game where you do risk getting lost, right? Like most of the first couple levels are pine trees and clouds and smoke. And you don't really ever feel like you're getting lost in Alan Wake.
Yeah, there's subtleties in just the design, which I think is really clever. Even just climbing up a ridge, or there's just it seems it's open but closed off, where it's not the serene open field in Nebraska. It's this really wooded place where only 10% of the terrain can actually be walked on, and they really embrace that. And I think that it just works from a design standpoint. And I love the cars existing in the game are so funny to me because it's a lovely touch, and you can tell that it's part of this. It's 1% of the system that was supposed to be presented to you, and it's probably so annoying for them to have designed all these cars and these physics, and then you just drive from one location to the other. But I dug the getting into the car and going, because it does give it this geographical heft as opposed to being on a world map or doing something in a JRPG where things feel a little bit smaller. And I especially loved how they incorporated combat into driving as well. You didn't have to almost ever really deal with anyone when you were in the car, but I would often just drive around areas and just kill everything, like get them in my headlights. And it was fun. Yeah. Like it just felt like a power fantasy in some way, in a game that otherwise felt had you feeling really vulnerable in some sense.
Yeah, no, I think the cars are an interesting touch, and they're certainly from the previous design of Alan Wake. So yeah, you
got to get them in there. I mean, it's good to have as opposed to these lost assets that are taken out of the game later. Since we're talking about gameplay, I did want to go back to gunplay. And Hoeg, like, talk to me about how you play the game. I mean, what's your technique? What do you like to do?
Again, after many years of honing my craft on Alan Wake, I like to take the flashlight and get it right up to the edge of where you're going to need to restore the batteries, and then let it kind of die, and then pulse it is the only way I can describe it. Like when you pulse the flashlight, when you focus it, they're going to usually give you a pause and cover their faces. Mm-hmm. So you can keep them spending a long time to get to you if you kind of pulse it with what energy that you have. And then, once they're done with their darkness, you light them up with the pistol, and it feels good. You feel good, man.
Yeah, it's interesting in that the game becomes manageable. First of all, any of the smaller enemies are manageable because, like you said, you can just pulse even the enemies that would throw something at you, and so that there are no projectiles, and then the game becomes not so dangerous. But even kind of massaging it with the bigger enemies, the enemies that require you to use active, light as opposed to just your passive light, which is fun to kind of do a little chip damage to them. I loved using the flares. I don't think I was nearly aggressive enough, especially in my playthrough on nightmare difficulty. And I would reflect at the end of a chapter. I didn't really know where things broke up, and I was just playing. I even though it was my second time through, and I just didn't quite remember. And then it's like, damn, I just finished that chapter. I had 7 flare gun ammo. I had 4, grenades. And because I'm just using the pistol and rifle ammo, it's like the whole elixir conversation in JRPGs in a Final Fantasy game. It's like, I just didn't want to use any of this shit. But in Nightmare, I tried to embrace it more. And again, like I was saying earlier, especially adopting the technique of the aggressive flare use as opposed to just throwing it and kind of running away and giving yourself space. Them. Like just charge through them because they all back off, which was so cool. And then trying to, I got all of the weapon trophies my first playthrough except for the hunting rifle because I felt like I didn't want to use its ammo, and then I just wouldn't end up using it. So I was very intentional about using the hunting ammo the hunting rifle. And I guess, and everything takes it Nightmare difficulty. If people want to check it out, it's not that much harder. I think everything takes 1/3 more damage, does maybe 1/3 more damage, and takes 1/3 more light.
Maybe I'll try that.
Yeah, it's pretty. That's my interpretation of it. I'm not very, like Hoeg said earlier about himself or whatever. I'm not the most talented player of games at all. So anything you see I platinum, or I'm gonna platinum this game probably after we finish because I have to just do a few of the random. I have 3 left. Like you have to do one where you have to get from like point A to point B without using a gun. There's one for like getting from like point A to point B without dying, and I think there's one from getting, but they're not difficult. I just incidentally didn't do them. So hopefully I have this platinum, and if I can do that, then I'm just telling you out there, it's not that hard. It's not a bespoke platinum by any stretch of the imagination. What did we think about the birds.
Oh,
Obviously
the ravens.
Hitchcockian in some major fashion, which is cool.
Well, based on
I
everything
like-
you've just told me, my answer would be you're not using the flare gun enough on the birds.
Oh, no, I didn't. I realized there's a point in the game in chapter 5 or 6 where you come to a point where you have an unlimited amount of flare gun ammo if you want it, and then you're fighting the birds. And at that point I realized, I'm like, I think that was totally lost on me that you were supposed to do that. I would just use the light
Yeah.
and they would just fall off,
The high
one at a
beam.
time.
Yeah.
So I made it much more difficult than I had to. So no, I totally didn't. But what do we think about this? I dug this. I felt like it was a cool feature, and it was never dangerous. I don't think I ever was killed in a bird attack. You first find them and you've had to fight them when Barry's like trapped in the cabin early in the
bird
game.
Boss fight, yeah.
Yeah, the bird. Yeah, it's kind of like a bird boss fight. What did you think of their inclusion? It's kind of a little variety there, Hoeg.
I like the birds. I like the birds a lot, and I like that that's the boss fight of I want to say it's chapter 2. I'm almost positive it's chapter 2 because that also has one of my favorite transitions at the end of the episode. And I do want to talk about it if it's not on your list, Colin. I want to talk about the music a little bit.
Please.
But the bird fight when Barry's in the cabin and he's saying, "You got to kill these birds, Alan. I'm sorry I ever doubted you." That's a nice beat in the narrative of the game, and it's not overly hard. And I understand why you just use the flashlight because you can see them dying. But you've got like a half dozen flares for that, and you can light up the sky with bird flares. And the flare gun, if we haven't talked about it enough, is one of my favorites because you do feel powerful. It is very cinematic. If you can explode it on someone, it lights them up, and then everybody around them kind of dies in slow motion.
It's awesome.
It's very, very cool.
Dig, how did you choose to approach combat? I'm curious what your flavor was.
Yeah, I mean, initially, I'm a big hunter-gatherer in games. I love to round things up. I like to make sure all my weapons are loaded. I like to make sure I'm scouring everything. And then you kind of quickly realize in this game, the game's designed around, sometimes you're started off with just a handgun or just a few flares. They're going to take things away from you. So once you kind of write yourself to that and sort of adjust and say, all right, I'm not gathering things for life here. It's not Resident Evil or something, So let me kind of form my strategy around just making sure I could get to the next checkpoint, but then also kind of satisfying because you realize you don't have to really conserve necessarily. You just have to survive. What I did sort of learn too late in the game was to incorporate the environment, like the live wires and the explosive canisters and stuff like that. Even some of the generated, the lights, the work lights and stuff, I wasn't using that stuff enough. So I was unnecessarily using too much ammo when I could have incorporated those things that were given to you. I loved, again, just enough to realize, okay, there's even a little more here that I'm not engaging with, which, super fun. And the ravens, I think, were important because listen, you only have the ravens, you have the Taken, the various forms of the Taken, you have the poltergeists, and you have that black ooze, that dark slime. But those are the only enemy types. So you needed an aerial component. And I did the same thing as you, though, Kyle. I just used the flashlight and the high beams to basically take care of them. I liked that the game seemed like I don't know that much about developing video games, but a little touch that I thought was cool was that you could take them out even when they were retreating. When those birds got far away, as long as you could catch them in your crosshairs, you could take them out still.
Yeah, they seem to fly into the hitbox and out of it again, yeah.
Which was kind of neat. You know what I mean? That's kind of sophisticated, I felt like, for that long ago. So I thought, again, just enough with the combat. At first, I kind of lamented the thing of like, oh man, where's all my shit? But that's the way the game's designed. And when you get used to that, it's fun.
Yeah, the game definitely handicaps you over and over again. Like the story has you losing all of your stuff. It becomes frustrating. I do love, because they take a little while to do it, but like I love the upgrading of the flashlight and then kind of getting downgraded again and then finding upgrades and better upgrades for the flashlight and
definitely
having to kind of explore that whole gamut and realizing that some of them have more power but more battery life or less battery life, whatever the case might be. I thought it was really, really well done and really fun. And yeah, using kind of the environmental stuff, the lights, some of those huge beams you can kind of direct at enemies. I imagine that many people play this game and make it harder for themselves than it has to be. I mean, I certainly did. Because I even had a billion of these batteries, and everything in a lot of these situations. Dig, did you play on PS5?
No, I played on Steam. I played the original on Steam.
Oh, so you played the one I was going to ask about this. So you did the one with, does it have the ads in it? Like the Verizon ads and the Energizer batteries and all that? Yep. That's awesome. Yeah. Cause mine is the one I played has that stuff all removed. In fact, I didn't read anything really about the synopsis or the game or the development until I beat it the first time. So when I went in, I was like, oh shit, I would have never even known. Like I was looking at screenshots of like a Verizon billboard and I was like, oh, that's so funny, man. I had no idea. So you played right the there, Steam version. That's interesting.
Black and white. Huge.
Yeah.
It's like, what is that? At first, when I saw it, like the first time I noticed the Verizon one, especially, I was like, is it a, like a playful logo, like a take on a logo? And then I was like, no, that's a Verizon logo. It's not
Verizon and Energizer.
Yeah. Energizer. Right.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. That's so funny. Yeah. It's, I had no idea that stuff was in there when I was playing through the first time. All right. Let's see here. What else do you want to, what did you had brought up something? The soundtrack I wrote down in my notes here. So what did you want to say about that, Hoeg?
Oh, just that I think it's a fantastic inclusion in the game that gives it a certain amount of professionalism, but also gives it kind of the vibes of prestige TV, right? Like if you watch something like Mad Men or Breaking Bad or something along those lines, where they have the music go into credits that reflects on what it is that you just saw. Like they use In Dreams, I think, in the first chapter. And then the second chapter, the transition I was mentioning that I really love so much is a song from someone I don't know that I've ever heard of called Haunted. And it starts out with this kind of ba-dum-bum-ba as you're watching the last scene where you realize that Rose is dragging Barry into a trap while the dark presence is using her voice. And then it like kind of scales back out and says end of chapter 2. And then the music starts, like the song starts in earnest. It's just like really good editing that you would expect from a high production TV show. And I remember watching that and thinking that was one of the coolest things that I had seen in games. And I still remember that transition. And the remaster, it was like one of the first things I went to. It's the Opera House in Final Fantasy VI to me.
Yeah. And, well said.
Well said. They do these kinds of things throughout all the chapters. And then from the menu, you can go and listen to the licensed music that they had. And again, this is Remedy. They're an independent studio. They were selling some of their space for Verizon and Energizer ads, and they spent money on these pretty unique, often famous songs, which I just think is something that I like to encourage in video gaming because I really do think it adds that bit of polish to the experience.
In my reading about the ads, I don't know if I read it on GameFAQs, like some random comment somewhere. I saw a few people laughing about how it's a somewhat funny ad for a battery company since the batteries die so quickly.
They really do.
And you're constantly like shuffling through.
That is interesting.
And Verizon, it's like Verizon Wireless, but you're like getting this broken up, conversation.
Yes, you only get fake calls from your dead wife.
Right, exactly. So it's pretty interesting, but I think
the
ringer
was off
as well.
On the ringer was off. That dude, and it ends. The music was so impressive. I was like, what? Like whenever there's a thing, it could be a TV show, it could be a game, when they're putting up so much money for the needle drop rights to shit like this. Roy Orbison. It ends with David Bowie, right? It ends with a David Bowie song. And I love the mixture of scoring and popular music. I always love that. It just works. It makes me think of things like Twin Peaks, but I love you saying, Hoeg, prestige television. Think of Sopranos or anything else that uses, there's just something, maybe it's not the right way to look at it, but it's always impressive when they're dropping crazy ducats just to have music that works. But when it really works, but beyond just the bragging rights, when it actually does work, it's another component just as important as the visuals or the gameplay, where it's just, that's the thing that's making this complete experience. That's what turns this into a memorable experience.
Yeah, and Remedy loves their transmedia stuff, right? So like they love the TV show. They love, Pat Maine isn't technically transmedia because it's just a voice actor doing a fake radio show, but it feels like it. It feels like you're getting a little radio show in the middle of your Alan Wake.
He's awesome. His voice is awesome.
It is great. And I love those beats because it makes it feel like a place, right? You feel like he's at a radio station and he's like, oh, I can't get to sleep tonight, but it's the witching hour. And call in, folks, with your crazy stories about this town I live in. And then by the time you show up at the radio station halfway through the game, you're like, oh, yeah, I know this. This is what you were talking about in those earlier things that I listened to on the radio. But all of that works together, and Remedy loves that stuff. I don't think it works quite as well in Control. I'm not gonna just smack down on Control, Colin, but like the video bits are less originating in the universe and they're more in your menu system in Control. And I think in Alan Wake, you're getting TV shots, you're getting things that are in your universe with the radio and everything else. And I think that works a little bit better as transmedia. And certainly the music, while it's not in universe, is used in a way that I think is very, very effective in Alan Wake.
I don't disagree with you at all. I think that that's what I was saying earlier about Control, is that it's like a whole library stack of information, but you have to like go into the menus. It does differentiate itself from the BioShock style audio logs where you go through the game. That was what was so clever about them. And I was talking to Ken Levine in our conversation about it, was just the very thought of saying like, just listen to this as you're going. It doesn't make any sense why this is here. Like, why would people just be talking into these things like they're the most secret, dark? It's just, but it's these dark like thoughts and all this, but it's awesome. And it's just there, and it works because it's a video game. And in some way, Control doesn't let you do that because you're kind of like that's what I was saying earlier. It's like you're studying it. There's just so much shit that you find in that game. It's crazy. There's hours and hours and hours and hours of stuff like to watch and go through in that game. In this game, you can probably stitch all of Pat Main's audio stuff and the TV shows into an hour or less, I would assume. If you sat there and really watched all of it and listened to all of it. And I did.
The Night Springs episodes aren't even 10 minutes long, I don't think.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
They're also informing the story that you're in at the time, right? Like it's all layers in Alan Wake. And like the Night Springs episodes are, when you look at what they're about, they're really about what you're doing in the game when you arrive at them. And
I don't think I even realized that. Tell me more about that.
Well, just they're a lot about creativity. They're a lot about choice and decision making and what it means within a story. And so when you watch the Night Springs, just kind of think about where you are and what your chapter is about. And I think for the most part, they'll all line up to what you're doing, and they're not just random.
Interesting. Yeah, I was so fascinated by the production value in them, like the very camcordery, very renegade style. Like they're doing something different. Like it's a different, especially different. No one does that stuff really still to this day, with very rare exception. And they were certainly. It reminds me a little bit of David Jaffe with Twisted Metal. We talked about that when I did the making of with him for the 1995 Twisted Metal, when I platinumed it earlier this summer. He and I sat down and talked, and he was saying like we videotaped a shit ton of stuff. We weren't allowed to use it, and like you can only see little remnants of it, like picture screenshots and freeze frames of it in the original game. But some people had a little bit of a foresight into that. Let's stick with you, because you had said you wanted to talk about the farm, and I think this is a thing worth talking about for sure. So Dr. Hartman has these patients, which we meet earlier in the diner, the Anderson brothers, Odin and Thor of the Old Guards of Asgard, the band, and you end up going to their compound. Talk to me a little bit about this part.
Yeah, so these guys are fantastic. And as I was mentioning with Max Payne, Remedy likes to make references to Norse mythology, right? So you've got Odin in this, or Odin Anderson has only one eye and he wears an eye patch. And you find out later on that that's not just an Odin reference, that they're trying to kind of match up with their Norse representatives. Thor is struck by lightning and is, of course, a stand-in for Thor. And you get all of this stuff on top of a story where they drink the lake water and they can see the future, give or take. And so then they write a rock song about it, as you do, because they know that when you fight the dark presence, you lose your memory, or you can lose your memory. That's one of the things that they do. So they put the clues to defeating the dark presence in a rock song, which Remedy writes and puts in the game, I think it's called The Poet and the Muse, which is about Thomas Zane and Barbara Jagger, who you recognize at that point as the dark presence as far as you're concerned. And then it gives you lyrics about essentially finding the clicker and the well-lit room and working through how to defeat the ultimate evil at the bottom of this lake. But it's really interesting to go and listen to the lyrics and have the story that you're playing represented. And of course, that's within the story of these two characters. And you find yourself at the farm listening to this record of the song, getting these bits, and then you fight off this huge barrage of Taken at a concert stage with like rock fireworks as your background and working to give you light to fight the darkness. And to me, that all goes together thematically, very similar to a level in Control, which I won't talk about anymore. But that's kind of the culmination of all of these thoughts about creativity and these various plot lines working together with a musical accompaniment and ridiculous kind of set piece design that you can only really do in video games. So to me, it's one of the best things in gaming ever.
Yeah, I love the stage when you're fighting and Barry's using the lighting fixtures and they keep breaking, and it's great. Yeah, it's awesome. Dave, what did you think of that part of the culmination of the story and that part of the game?
My mind was blown. It's one of those things that's happening to you in a game. This is no hyperbole where you're like, I'm going to always remember this. It was like, this was definitely my gaming moment of 2023, but I put it in top 10 gaming moments ever because not only is it brilliant, it's just completely unexpected. You know, you're in the middle of a farm at night in this rural setting. And of course, you have the Anderson brothers, and they're charming and they're awesome. But what I love about these guys is that their story leads to this moment where, you know, you have this animatronic dragon and the pyrotechnics and the light. You're incorporating the whole light mechanic into this survival battle on this stage in the middle of the farm with this, you know, it reminds me of like a Sleeping Beauty style dragon. And then Barry's messing with the lights. So you have to survive, power up in the light long enough, you know, it's going to go back out, survive a little longer. It was just one of those things that I think I was talking to myself out loud what was happening. I was like, I can't believe how cool this is. Who would have thought that was going to happen? That was going to be the next thing. You know, you're in the woods, you're on a farm, you got broken bridges, and you're trying to drive around this area with looks like campgrounds and stuff like that, and just rural Washington, and all of a sudden you're on this stage. I just thought it was like, as far as like what Hoeg was saying, like a set piece in video games, definitely one of the most creative things I've ever seen. And who could have ever guessed that was going to happen? It's like my mind, I was completely blown away by it.
Yeah, I love the whole wrapping in the song and the the bad or questionable writing of the song, and it's so funny. It is a very funny and almost self-aware moment. I think that it just adds to the game's surrealism, and I love the set piece moments that have you fight, because I enjoy the combat, like I was saying earlier, quite a bit. But I also like that the game is easy to manipulate at times, and these moments of the game force you to just play within the bounds of constant, almost horde mode like combat. And I think that's where the game actually shines. It shines in its plot and shines in its direction, but it also shines in its gameplay. So these moments where it forces you to play it as it's really intended to. And what I mean by breaking it is your health regenerates whether you get into the light or not. If you just stand around, your light will regenerate if you just stand there. You can really, there's a part of the game where, I think it's in chapter 5, I think I actually might have wrote it down, where basically there's a warehouse. You jump into this part of the game where there's like this warehouse and you have to fight all these enemies. But if you only have 3 flares with you, you can just walk through the entire section. The enemies won't get you. You get to the next light. And then from there, you can just run directly through the next set of enemies to the next light, and so on and so forth. And I don't think the game is necessarily, it's cool that it gives you options, but I don't think it's necessarily by newcomers meant to be played that way. And so it kind of allows you to circumvent some of its gameplay in a lot of different ways. So yeah, these set pieces, while they seem really forced, like where there's a part where like the float comes by, the deer hunting float comes by, and then all these enemies are behind it. It's like really, it's very cool. I loved playing the game. Hoeg, I wanted to ask you about this because I assume you have insight into this. You know more about this game than we do. But what's with the red chair seen in various places? Do you know what I'm talking about? There's like a red,
I don't
like there's like a nice chair, like fabric chair. How would you describe it, Dave? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And you find it like 5 or 6 times throughout the game. There's one even where it's like on the edge of like a mountaintop, like looking over the mountains, and there's like beers next to it. Almost looks like a scene from Fallout. Do you have any insight into this?
I don't. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Dave, did you notice this?
Yeah, it could, just because the chair seems so out of place.
Right, exactly.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I actually should have looked into it. I didn't really know more about it than that.
Yeah, I didn't know if that was just a surreal sort of David Lynchian touch, or if that was something that had deeper meaning. I wasn't sure about that.
Let's talk, and something I think you'll have more of a grasp on than I do, Hoeg, for sure, is the Agent Nightingale stuff. He's just what is going, this is probably the part of it I understand the least, because it seems like a MacGuffin almost. Like he what does he have to do with anything? He's from the real FBI, or is she from like the people in control?
Well, he's from he was an FBI agent, and he got booted out after his partner died, I believe, if I'm remembering this all correctly. But I think for the most part in the story that we're playing in Alan Wake, he's just a character that Alan introduces to kind of control for the sheriff police problem. Right. So, I mean, one of the things it's happening in that story is that Alan says a number of times, like, you can't just move people where you want them. So he's got an issue, which is Sarah Breaker and the police are very likely to be not on his side. And so he introduces the Nightingale character in order to kind of make things work a little bit better. And then he gets rid of the Nightingale character just as easily. Right. I think the manuscript page is like the darkness comes and takes him away. Like, that's what Alan Wake came up with. And he gets swept out of the jail cell room at like the top of chapter 4 or 5. And so I think his deal is that he's a thinly written character that doesn't have much of a deal. But you don't understand what he's about the whole game, really, is that he's just an old FBI character that has come after Alan Wake and is designed to prevent the sheriff's office from coming down too hard on him, I think. But again, that goes back to your question of, can you apologize for some hackish, somewhat stymied writing in this game because of its overall design conceit? And yes, I think it protects itself that way.
Yeah, it does. But it has to come out off as not a cop out, which it doesn't, because it's not trying, I don't think, in some ways as hard as it could be to make that bar or whatever. Otherwise it would come off as like trying to split the difference, which would piss me off personally. By the way, I quickly looked up the red chair thing. A lot of people are asking about this on the Alan Wake wiki. What it says is there are several large red chairs located in Alan Wake, likely a reference to Twin Peaks' second episode where Agent Cooper is dreaming of Laura Palmer, the victim of the murder he is investigating. So I guess he falls asleep in that chair or whatever.
Yeah, I haven't seen that in so long.
Yeah, I'm only on the 4th episode of Twin Peaks.
Assuming it's a Twin Peaks reference is a safe bet.
Yeah, I would assume so. I think Twin Peaks is so interesting and surreal. I'm trying to be patient with it as well, because I think it's a little strange in some, like, not in a good way. I'm like, all right, let's get going.
That's interesting. I think David Lynch, not just Twin Peaks, and there's Fire Walk with Me Now and all of his movies. I think he's very tuned into horror in a very unique way that other horror creators aren't. When he gets horror right, it's some of the scariest shit. I think of things like Blue Velvet. I think of things like Eraserhead. He's very good at creating things that are unsettling. I wished there was more stuff like that in the game that was actually properly scary. And I know when something's not scary because I'm scared of literally everything. So I wish this game was a little more frightening. That's my only lament.
Yeah, it comes off more of like a pop horror thriller of some sort.
Definitely.
Nothing too crazy, prime time television on a network TV station. Yeah, nothing too crazy. Twin Peaks-ish in its own way. I mean, and watching Twin Peaks and knowing what it's about, at least so far, they show so little that it doesn't ever come off as being overtly scary. And by the way, I don't know if you saw it, Dig. I sent you the theme song last night of Twin Peaks, which I'm completely obsessed with. Just absolutely obsessed with that theme song. I can't. It speaks to me in some weird way. I don't know. It's
that's a portal right back to the early 90s, too. Right? It just feels like that era for some reason.
Yeah, it almost feels.
What's kind of cool about Twin Peaks too? There's other things that are older, like Hill Street Blues, where there was like really, well-regarded works of television. It's not just Sopranos and Game of Thrones, The Wire, and all this stuff we got later. But that's the cool thing about Twin Peaks was prestige television many years ago. Didn't start with all the stuff that we often think started it. Really started. It was just fewer and far between back then. And it's not Twin Peaks isn't for everybody.
No, certainly not. Yeah, I can see a lot of people tuning in even at the time being like, what the fuck is this?
Especially that
I think that's actually right. Yes. Yeah. I believe that was the response in a lot of places. But no, I'll espouse the virtues of 90s TV. We can have a whole episode on Babylon 5 sometime.
Oh, man. I was just talking about Babylon 5 with someone recently, and and that those show, that there was like a weird the rejuvenation of Star Trek on TV with the Next Generation. I think really paved the way for a lot of stuff to come out. I mean, not that was the only thing. I mean, there was obviously interstitial stuff like Battlestar Galactica and all the rest. Anyway, Hoeg, I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to throw it over to you to talk about the Lady of the Light, Cynthia Weaver.
Cynthia Weaver.
Yeah, talk to me about her. Like, we see her in the very beginning. There's obviously something to her. We see her in the diner, and she's holding her lantern, and she's like, "Oh, young man, don't go in the." And then it's like, all right, what this lady's obviously going to be important later on. So we finally meet her after we geolocate her via the Anderson's house. What do you make of her?
Well, Cynthia Weaver is a great character, again, because they do such a great job of kind of giving you little bits and bops throughout the game. As you say, when you're first in the Oh Dear Diner, she's looking at this dark hallway that you're going to go down and lamenting the fact that she can't get the lights to go on and that we need to make sure that the lights work in this town. And then her storyline is that she knows about the Dark Presence. She knows about Thomas Zane. She knows about Barbara Jagger. And so she's crazy to everybody in town when you arrive in 2010, but she's actually the only one that really knows what's going on. And throughout the game, you've been finding these caches of power and light weaponry that's been put by people from Team Cynthia Weaver. And I think all that is just great. Like, one of the game mechanics that I love the most about Alan Wake is finding stuff with your flashlight, right? Finding that yellow paint is such a cool kind of kids fun. Like, there are toys that used to be at the Toys R Us where you would kind of x-ray buildings and things with a little square that you could put on pictures, and then you find secrets, and that's fun. That's a good time for a kid. And then in Alan Wake, you get arrows that direct you to weapons that you need, and that's great, but it doesn't make a lot of sense until you kind of get the Cynthia Weaver plotline working. And I just like all of those ways that they make the kind of primordial light versus darkness work within this environment that they've created. So it's power and light. It's Cynthia Weaver. And it's I think in The Poet and the Muse, she's what? She's the Lady of Light that's crazy. Like, everybody thinks she's raving or whatever that lyric is. And I don't think we do enough imaginative stuff in anything, not just video games, but movies and TV and books and video games. And Alan Wake, with this character, with the Andersons, with all of this coming together at once, leading into one of my favorite kind of finales of video games, which is when you're in the dark place yourself and you're dealing with creativity and its powers, all works together.
Yeah, true. What do you have to say about this, Dagan? I think that's very well said. What do you think about the kind of the culmination here with Cynthia Weaver and the light and all the rest?
It's super fun. I mean, it's just a fun idea to take the town basket case, right? The foil hat crazy lady, and make her the only one that has any awareness of what's actually happening. It's like everybody else is the idiot. Everybody else is really the crazy person. She's the only one with the wherewithal to know. And kind of the selflessness. It's kind of an interesting character if you really think about it, right? She's kind of putting it all on the line, and trying to sing the gospel, and everybody's just like, you're a baddie,
She spends her whole life trying to save him.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I think that I'm a little lost here, so I'd love to hear from Hoeg about this, and Dig, you probably understand this better than me too, is that you were saying this earlier, is like the problem with Zane was that or at least one of the problems was the writing didn't make sense, right? Like, the writing has to make sense and be like cogent in some way. Wake says this multiple times.
The cool part about Alan Wake's powers is that I don't think he can manifest things whole cloth, at least not if they don't fit onto the playing board as it stands. So that's something that you have as a limit. Like, this is what I like about rules and even laws in my normal day job, is that working within confines is what makes things interesting. So Alan Wake isn't like an omnipotent god. He has to work within the strictures of storytelling. And his story has to be good in that it has to be believable by like the people, but it doesn't have to be good in a way that we would recognize as good writing necessarily. So Thomas Zane, his issue is that he puts a piece of manuscript talking about Alan Wake's past in a shoebox with a clicker. That doesn't make any damn sense for the timeline that we're watching in Alan Wake, right? So you get into this question of like, did Thomas Zane create Alan Wake? Is Alan Wake a purely fictional character? Did Alan Wake create Thomas Zane, right? Because when you're in this kind of loop of creativity manifesting itself in reality, Alan Wake can write somebody that writes his backstory. So, like, what in the heck is Thomas Zane is one of the fun questions of Alan Wake. If there's any concern I have about Alan Wake 2, is that they will add too many definitive answers to all of this nonsense, which is one of the reasons that I like it so much, is flipping it around in your brain over and over again.
Because even as the game ends and it culminates around, it's somewhat the best they could do with, let's say, call it one of the boss fights they can do. You do what you can do at the end of the game where you don't really introduce very many new mechanics. You have the swirling objects and all the rest, and it's fine. Like you were saying earlier, Dig, the black ooze, or what I would call is the taken ejaculate that you find all over the place.
That puts a different spin on the game. Yeah, I have to say
it definitely does. But we see. So where do we feel the game? How do we feel the game ends? Alice is alive, right? But Alan. Well, we know Alan's stuck in the dark place because he's there in the DLC packs. Did you guys play the DLC at all?
I only played the first one because they released over the course of a couple of months, and I haven't played them in the remaster.
Yeah, I played through both of them. I'm a little confused by them. They seem to be first of all, as I recall, they came out pretty quick considering the size of Remedy, and they're very asset flippy. They definitely left me with more questions than answers, so I won't speak on them with any authority because I don't really have anyone to bounce that stuff off of. But it's yeah, it's, I don't know. They focus in, one of them is like very focused in on the whole notion of the writing itself, like we see at the end of Alan Wake, where you start seeing the words themselves. Like that's a whole focus of one of them. And the other one is like Zane, I think, talking Alan through like becoming the actual rational Alan, like the real Alan or whatever, and like the different divergences that his life can take or whatever. But it's a little confusing. I'm very interested to see what the second one's all about, because
oh man,
I am
so excited.
Yeah, like I guess I will answer if Alan is it that Alan Wake isn't a real character. I guess you would have to interpret him as being real ultimately, right? Like,
I mean, the fun part about that conversation is Alan Wake is obviously not a real person. He's in a video game we're talking about.
Yeah, right. That's right. That's true enough. But I think that it's like that the ending with the Harry Garrett show and all of that, when he's all drunk and it's kind of a flashback to his book tour and like when he was coming off the high of his last book and before he's really settling in on the fact that he doesn't have the idea for his following book. It does establish some sort of real world credibility for me. I don't know that like all of these things are happening. I think that that's kind of the idea of flashing to that New York City apartment in some ways, is grounding it in his known reality, not this alternate reality that has been spun up. So I feel like he'll be in there somewhere. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
I don't know.
I'll find myself wanting him to exist in this world, even though I'm not really drawn to the character. I think because I just want to see it resolve, and I want to feel like I don't think they would do this because I think it's much more sophisticated, but I don't want anything like, oh, it was just a dream, that sort of hackneyed, contrived ending,
Yeah, no, I don't think they will, because I think the dark presence, the dark place, the creative power of the lake are real. So once you concede that, I think you have to deal with that in your plot. But I'm not sure that Alan Wake appearing in what we would traditionally think of as real life places is necessarily the answer to the question, Colin, because I think from the Cauldron Lake power that we have seen is that you can manifest reality. So to the extent Thomas Zane needed an Alan Wake at some point, he could have invented that whole backstory that would have happened in reality with the power of Cauldron Lake, but it wouldn't be real. It would be a Thomas Zane creation.
Yeah.
But similarly, Alan Wake can create Thomas Zane. I mean, like that, you can't solve this, and I hope they don't. But that's one of my favorite bits of this story. And I'll be honest with you, when I started Alan Wake, and they start with that quote that says, like, you can't get answers because answers are dumb in horror, I was worried because that sounds like a cop-out right from the start, right? Like, okay, this isn't going to make any sense at all, and this is going to be nonsense by the time we get to the end. And I was so happy that it wasn't. Like, I was so happy with the clicker and light versus darkness and getting Barbara Jagger at the end. And like, that's one of the feelings that I came away with is, oh no, these guys knew what they were doing. Even though Alan ends in a very ambiguous place and with not much resolution for his story. The main character, the title character's storyline really isn't resolved. And that never really bothered me.
Yeah, That all makes sense. I mean, that's Dig. What do you think about how
There's
everything
something
culminates
really
and where we leave
elegant
it?
about that. What
Yeah.
Hoeg just said, it seemed like that was the theme here. One question answered, two more questions to ask ourselves. The Thomas Zane connection is interesting because you guys shed a lot more light on the subject. I was looking at it as like this generational thing where in this place over time, it's always been this dark force or this evil, malevolent thing against the creative people. And this has just been a constant churning, just a new writer, for instance. But I like the connection of maybe this is the same thing. Maybe this is the same person, just another form of the same thing. I mean, what I loved about this game is it kept me, every time I thought I had a problem with it, it won me over. You guys were talking about the driving thing before. I felt like the driving thing works because at first I was a little disappointed with the fact that you couldn't run for long periods of time. You would get winded.
Yeah,
so
that's
you
true.
would have that cool down period, right? And that gets frustrating. But then that makes the driving very rewarding because now you could traverse these large open areas quickly. So you look forward to jumping in a car so you could get to point A to point B much quicker rather than having to run and then rest and then you get, recover and that sort of thing. So there was always something in the game that I felt in the gameplay and in the story that kept winning me over and stringing me along in a good way. I wanted to be down for it. I wish I knew about the DLC. I found out, I went in really blind. I found out too late. And then I think I heard one of the special features ends with a Depeche Mode song, which I was like, God damn it. That now I have to play those.
Yeah, you should definitely play them. I think each is only like an hour long or so.
Yeah, they're not super long.
Oh, that's not bad.
Yeah, they're included in the complete collection. That's why I played them, but they're probably, I don't know if they're necessary or not. I mean, Hoeg, you would know this better than us. Is American Nightmare necessary, do you think, to play for this story?
I wouldn't call it necessary, but I think it has useful information in it about more. I apologize. It's difficult for me to separate my knowledge of like the Alan Wake universe rules from where I learned it. So American Nightmare might have some of the stuff I'm referencing about Alan Wake not being able to just create things out of whole cloth, that it has to fit in with details. Like some of American Nightmare is about that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I might check it out on Xbox because I was wondering, I was kind of putting it up to the wire because it just seems weird to me that they didn't re-release that too. Like, where is that? And I was wondering if they were just going to kind of stealth release it as a piece of marketing at the last minute to be like, oh, here's American Nightmare, but I just
the
don't
lawyer
think
in me
it's gonna
says rights issues.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Why would they rights with Microsoft, do you think, or people that they license?
Microsoft, or it could be music.
Yeah.
Music.
Yeah, that's interesting because you would assume that they got everything, the whole kit and caboodle with that. So yeah, I was kind of expecting that as like a marketing beat, but it just never came to fruition. So I think if I'm interested, it's very short as I understand. So
it's not as short as the DLCs, but yeah. I mean, they might also just not be as proud of it. I mean, it was kind of aiming for a little bit more action orientation after they got some of the criticism about Alan Wake Prime. And so they might just not love it. I don't know. But it's not nothing. There are little bits and bobs of storytelling in there, but it's certainly not as deep or as layered as the original.
Yeah, good to know. Well, first of all, do we touch on everything everyone wanted to talk about before we close things out? Or Hoeg, did you have anything else in your notes that you wanted to speak to?
I can check on my notes. I think the only thing I haven't mentioned specifically was that, and I think you touched on this, Colin, is I really love how organic the levels feel. Like, especially after you've played it a number of times, you can see where the levels are, but they give enough kind of width, enough breadth to like where the pathway is that it often feels like you're in a forest, that you're in a big area, even when you can rub up against the cliff wall or whatever, and it's not actually that big. So I really like how they handled that. And again, it's all kind of elegant, wise use of resources, right? Like, this isn't a $600 million production. This is something that a smallish team had to figure out how to put together in a way that worked. And as you rightly pointed out, it was a pare down of a bigger, more ambitious effort originally. I think otherwise I've covered mostly everything. Intellectually stimulating the whole time is one of my other notes here, which I really love. And yeah, no, I think I've talked about it about as much as I wanted to. I would just, again, kind of advocate for the combat in the game as being representative of the story and the character of Alan Wake, right? Even the running, right, is informative of the fact that this guy's a writer. He's not the typical athlete game hero protagonist character, and he does get tired very easily. And that informs the character. Like every choice that they made was to focus on their theme and their storytelling more than the gameplay. And I love that. I love, if you're going to tell me a story, if I'm going to spend 15 hours with you, spend that time telling me a story that I care about.
Yeah, I was frustrated with the running at first, and then I kind of started reading it within the context, not only with Alan Wake's like lack of athleticism, but also he's not walking to begin with. He's going at like a jog or like a jaunt of some sort. So he's already moving. And so like he's going in a little bursts of quick speed, which I would imagine it didn't really bother me once I thought about it from that perspective. Plus, it would have been so easy to break the game. It would have made the game so easy if you could run for even twice as long. You could just run to the next light or whatever. So, Dig, what are your closing comments here as we wrap things up?
I mean, I really enjoyed it. This is some of the best 13 hours I've spent with a video game. I loved it. I was sorry to see it end. That's always the mark of a good game, you know. And I love all the cinematic nods. I love all the horror fiction send ups. I love when a thing just wears its heart on its sleeve in terms of influence. And when the end result is purely original and unique, that's kind of special. You know, I feel like a lot of people must have slept on this game. And maybe with the advent of the second one in October, people will find their way back to it. But I would highly, highly recommend it. I mean, I had a really great time. And again, it's style and substance. I mean, this game just has everything.
I wonder how many people will play Alan Wake 2 without having played the first one, and how much the game is engineered with that in mind as well. Like
13 years is a long time.
Yeah, like I wonder. I'm curious about that. Like, they've made this first one accessible. They've made it very accessible by giving it away on PS Plus. I don't know if it was on Game Pass at one point. Obviously, I think the first one's probably on Game Pass with Xbox 360 backwards compatibility. So I just it's as accessible as it can be, and so I guess it's up to people to opt in at that point. But I'm really rooting for them with the second game. I'm very, very curious about it. I've become a Remedy fan, I think, over this time. I really want to get into some of the stuff I've missed, and really anticipating Control 2 as well, more than like someone like Hoeg would be. But when
I'll give it another chance. I just didn't like the story of Control 1. Remedy is one of the developers that I trust the most, and so expectations always play into these things. I said this even when I was reviewing Control, where I said, look, this is coming off of Alan Wake for me. I adore Remedy, and I just don't think they did much with the storytelling of this environment. And so, yeah, go nuts on Control 2. If you can put that in there, I'll be there. I don't dislike it for any stronger reason than I just didn't think that you put your best foot forward in storytelling.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Wikipedia for Remedy, and yeah, Control 2 doesn't have a date yet. And they're also doing that multiplayer game, right? Which is Condor, which is another Control game. And 505 is funding that as well. Plus, they're doing Max Payne and Max Payne 2 remakes for Rockstar. And then they're doing their Tencent game, Vanguard, which no one knows anything about. But Control 2 is announced properly in 2021. So I would imagine that could be ready next year. Or in 2024, or maybe 2025 if not. But that would be awesome. And they can keep rolling. So anything left unsaid, Hoeg, that you wanted to talk on otherwise?
Just that Alan Wake is great. And I do get the impression from Remedy interviews and from them bringing it back 13 years later that in some ways Alan Wake is their baby. Like this is the one that is the pinnacle that they're the happiest with, whether that's Remedy on the whole or just Sam Lake, I don't know. But even though I didn't like Control, I am as enthusiastically excited about Alan Wake 2 as anything this year, which is probably my favorite year in the history of video games. But I think Alan Wake 2 is going to be a banger, as those hip kids like me say.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, I'm really excited to play it too. It's definitely all over my radar now after not being on it maybe just as a couple of months ago. Dig, closing comments. And by the way, before I get to Dagan, actually, Hoeg, thanks for joining us too.
Oh yeah, this is great.
Dig, closing comments from you, my friend.
Yeah, man, I am front and center for Alan Wake 2. My only thing on the wish list is that when I'm playing and I go downstairs in the kitchen for a snack at 1 a.m, I want to be afraid this time. You know, when I could do that at night with everybody sleeping, I'm really a scaredy cat. Hoeg may not know this about me, And this game wasn't doing that for me.
I don't mind it being scarier. I just don't want it to be the kind of fake jump scares. Like that just doesn't do it for me.
That's a great point. Like actually genuinely horrific somehow. The jump scares, I'm with Hoeg on that 100%. But yeah, there's just something where, I don't know. There just wasn't something frightening about shadowy utility men. It's like that guy looks like he should be up on a telephone pole.
Yeah.
And now he's chasing me. It's just, it was fun.
Yeah, fair enough.
But not scary.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And it was really nice to do a show with Hoeg and finally meet. And it was long overdue. I enjoyed it very much.
This is fun.
Yeah. Well, thanks, guys. I appreciate this. I'm glad we were finally able to do this. They accommodated me on a shift in schedule. We were supposed to do this a little bit earlier, but Mike and I had to go to an appointment. So that just interrupted everything. And then Dagan couldn't participate anymore. So I wanted to give him more time. So we got it all framed and ready to go. So hopefully people enjoy this conversation. And if they haven't played the game yet, and I hope they have, if they've listened to it this far, I hope it compels you to go and play it and give it a try. Alan Wake 2 comes out in late October. So look forward to that. And we'll obviously cover that. We'll have Hoeg back for that as well. At the time, because I look at the games coming out this fall, and I'm almost through everything that I care about, because we have that Infinity Strash Dragon Quest game that I want to play, and then Alan Wake 2 and Spider-Man are in October, and then that Banishers game comes out in November, and I think that's it for me.
Wait a second.
Yeah.
Where's Mario Wonder on this list?
Oh, I'm not playing that.
Come on.
No.
I am shocked.
I'm good on that. Michael will play that. Michael will be all over that. She's all over her Switch. I watch her play it all the time. That's enough. Just being around it is enough for me. Yeah. Yeah. Hoeg, were you going to say something?
No, I just said Wonder will be cool.
Oh yeah. It looks great. I'll play by proxy, let's say, with that. All right, my friends, I appreciate your time. Thank you all out there for your love, kindness, and support. Listening to us here on Sacred Symbols, Last Stand Media, and Patreon. You know the drill for support. LastStandMedia.store for merch. We'll see you next time for more. Until then, goodbye. Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is a product and trademark of Last Stand Media and Colin's Last Stand LLC, and is proudly recorded in the USA. The show is conceived by, is written by, and is directed by me, Colin Moriarty. My co-hosts are Chris Raygun Maldonado and Dustin Furman. The show is produced by executive producer Dustin Furman. It's edited by associate producer Ben Smith. All of Last Stand's theme music is by my best friend, Ramon Narvaez. As you know, all of Last Stand's shows, including Sacred Symbols, are fan-funded on Patreon at patreon.com/laststandmedia. The following names are at the producer level on Patreon, our highest tier, and we're grateful for your thoughtful and kind contributions to our independent endeavor. Thank you.